Hi, everyone. This is Carrie Cassidy from Project Camelot, and I am going to put the poster on the screen now, so bear with me. And we have Douglas Dietrich here. Hi, again, this is Carrie Cassidy from Project Camelot, and I am here tonight with Douglas Dietrich. And this is our second interview in a short number of weeks. And that's because the last interview was so fascinating that we decided we had to have him back right away. And so we're going to cover some things here that we weren't able to cover last time. And that's quite an interesting list. But before I do all that, I'm going to really briefly look over his bio and see what I can tell you about him. And in the meanwhile, Douglas, let me bring you on the screen, and then everyone can sort of say hello to you while we're looking at your bio. So say hello to the audience.
I'm glad to be here. It's always an honor. Thank you very much, Madame Cassidy.
Oh, you're welcome. So here we have, he is a naturalized American citizen, born of a Caucasian American sailor, George Joseph Henry Dietrich. And he was in nationalist China, the Republic of China, as reestablished on the island of Formosa, Taiwan. His father is retired from the U.S. Navy after 30 years of duty covering gunboat patrol in the twilight years of the warlord China. And it appears that he was also involved to some degree in the Korean conflict, and Vietnam also was going on during that time. So Douglas himself is a Department of Defense research librarian for a decade. And he's no longer doing that job, obviously, but he's a very well-known radio show and talk show personality, and basically a military historian. So he covers subjects such as Pearl Harbor, Roswell, Vietnam, different ethno-national holocausts, as well as documents that expose the reality behind vampires, zombies, Soviet psychic warfare, and other occult phenomena. He has volumes of notes pertaining to Tesla, H.P. Lovecraft, and L. Ron Hubbard, the Vatican, and the United Nations. And wow, his bio is, by the way, on my website. So my website has been under attack today, but I think it's back up and looks okay at the moment. So that's what we're dealing with. And last time, let me just say that we did deal with the Max Spears death and various things pertaining to that. We also covered Douglas's time in the Presidio. So if you're not quite caught up, you didn't see the last broadcast, then I encourage you to go to my YouTube channel where you are now. If you're seeing this in theory, or on my website, you can click the YouTube button, and then you can find the earlier interview with him. It was just done about 3 or 4 weeks ago. So Douglas, with that underway, can we ask you to briefly talk about yourself in terms of kind of, I know that you just went to Arizona, or I believe, and you gave, I'm sure, a lovely talk there, and I wish I could have been there in person. So you want to tell us a little bit about that, your latest travels, and what you've been up to.
Thank you very much for bringing that subject up. There were, of course, and there always are security issues. There always are a lot of threats that are basically directed towards me quite personally on my answering service of my telephone at home, which is one of the reasons why I rarely check my answering service. And when I do, it's basically to kind of do a lot of clearing out of such messages. I was very fortunate that the last month that we spoke, I was able to catch the messages from Mata and Cassidy, and we were able to reestablish our communicative relationship after a period of many years. And we had, of course, brought up the fact that I would be going down to Arizona and speaking. The subject, of course, was on Roswell, because we were in the area of the Southwest, and that is something that, of course, had originally made myself quite notorious. To kind of put this in some sort of perspective, the first time that I really got on air with Coast to Coast AM and became widely known to the public was because I had exposed the papers betraying the American plans to bomb Japan, which led to the preemptive surgical strike by the Japanese against the American base at Pearl Harbor, which was one of the source points for the coordinated attack on Japan. That is why the American planes were all in a row and on the tarmac waiting to take off for their bombing raids against Japan, the same way they were caught on Clark Field in the Philippines. So at that point, I became very, shall we say, accepted by Coast to Coast AM. Obviously, what I had presented was incontrovertible. The evidence was undeniable. And as a result, because of the documents I was able to cite and expose, Coast to Coast AM was quite happy to have me on again. And they scheduled such for Veterans Day. So I could speak to veterans issues. But then, of course, what happened was very shortly after that, I was at a UFO conference doing my best to certainly make known what I was exposing. And what I exposed about Roswell, of course, was the fact that it concerned Japanese prisoners of war, that many of these, of course, were purely ethnic Japanese at the time of Roswell. It's important to emphasize, of course, that many Asian prisoners of war, there were 1,500 of them that were recognized to be in the United States. A third of them were Korean, a third of them were Taiwanese, and a third of them were Japanese in 1945. None of them ever made it home alive. These particular prisoners were, of course, even more physically striking in the sense that they were very minute as aeronauts. They were of the Yakuza background, meaning they were of the gangster background, where they had been recruited from, because very similar to the Americans who had mobilized La Cosa Nostra, their own mafia, to patrol the docks, to conduct union breaking, and basically terrorize laborers during the Second World War into continued production. So too the Japanese Empire mobilized its own underworld elements. But these individuals, of course, were just pronounced enough in their physical differences. The fact that as part of the Yakuza cult, they were all missing their pinkies due to the little finger being extracted during various promotional and rank privileges that are gained within that organization. It's part of the ceremonial sacrifice that is conducted within that particular secret society. Because of such differences, the fact that their heads were shaved of all bodily hair, including their eyebrows, because they wanted to prevent static electricity from interfering with their working with their unconventional aircraft. All of this, of course, was resulted in many people who saw them as being easily convinced they were from another world. However, the original firemen responding to pick up the bodies from the wreckage sites did state they were clearly Japanese. And of course, later on, this was never investigated. It was never an issue until the 1970s when it did become an issue. What happened was that my former responsibility in terms of my secretarial duties as a liaison was Colonel Michael Aquino. Michael Aquino, of course, was somebody who was involved in the military at a much later date than the Second World War. He went to Vietnam in 1968, where he served for a period of time until he was called back in 1969. His tour of duty was actually shortened because of the fact that Sergeant Melvin Brown, who had personally been at Roswell, began to say that these were Japanese prisoners of war. And of course, everyone referenced them per military regulations. Everybody called them aliens. That was not a extraterrestrial connotation at that time. So when Melvin Brown began to talk, what happened was that Michael Aquino, who was part of the U.S. Army, was brought back as a psychological operations expert, having proven himself on the field of battle in Vietnam, to handle the situation domestically. And he came up with the Roswell myth that everyone is familiar with his co-religionist, a person who lived in San Francisco at the time, the same city that Michael Aquino lived in, same city that I lived in, Stanton Friedman. Both of them, of course, maintain the horned brow to show that they are part of the ranks of their satanic religious organization. And as a co-religionist, Stanton Friedman began the Roswell myth that it was extraterrestrial aliens as opposed to enemy aliens. Very important to remember that all Japanese were considered enemy aliens, whether they were in Japan or in the United States throughout the Second World War. And all documents dealing with Japanese reference them as enemy aliens. So this term, of course, began to be abused by Michael Aquino through his new PSYOPs campaign, and it's impacted America ever since. So
okay,
when I was exposing,
now because this is a sort of what you might call something of a hot button issue,
yes.
And I did want to talk about it tonight. So
Yes.
what I want to ask you is how do you come by this information? And you know, if you can lay it out kind of carefully so that we can kind of compare notes a little bit on this, because certainly there are many stories out there, and your claims about Stanton Friedman are probably not well known, at least along those lines. And so, you know, we want to be careful here and sort of cite any documentation or whatever you might have.
Sure. Basically, what happened was that Stanton Friedman was involved, of course, with many. He claims he never worked with the government, which is an out-and-out lie. Stanton Friedman, of course, worked with the government quite intensively and incestuously because he was involved with any number of corporate contracts that dealt with nuclear flight. He was involved with the Convair NH B-36 scandal, which was essentially something that was going on through the Eisenhower administration and ultimately was stopped at the time of the Kennedy administration. And what this was a claim that the American forces were working with nuclear flight. And they, of course, never developed nuclear flight. They simply put leaky nuclear reactors in the air. They got them airborne in basically B-36s that were declared too unsafe for normal combat duties. Literally, the Convair in B-36 that was used for the particular nuclear flight quote unquote project was one that had actually been torn apart in a hurricane, and it was reassembled with a very heavy lead shield behind the pilot's compartment. And then a leaky nuclear reactor was installed into the plane, not to power the plane. The plane was powered by conventional fuel, and it was a prop-driven plane. It was a reciprocating engine powered plane, propeller driven. And so they got this thing up in the air, and they would fly it all over the United States and radiate the public. All of this is vettable. All of this is verifiable. Stanton Friedman was heavily involved with that. That's incontrovertible. And his own documentary evidence of his background and his resume, which he uses to cite himself as a nuclear physicist, damns him in that regard in terms of his contracts. And yet he comes out and says, I never worked with the government. It's preposterous. So the reality is, of course, he did work with the government. He was involved with something that has led indirectly to the deaths of many, many Americans, because the Convair MBH-36 would fly low overhead, and they called it the SLAM project, which stood for slow, low, and messy. When it would fly low over barns, it would literally microwave chickens in their coops. It was spreading enough radiation where many people all over the United States contracted radiation cancer. Many people came down with cancer all over the United States because of many nuclear tests. This was part and parcel to that kind of nuclear abuse by the United States military-industrial complex. By the time it was all over, Stanton Friedman knew that the United States was so irradiated, he didn't want to live in the United States anymore, so he moved to Canada and got himself Canadian citizenship. All of that's a fact. He comes down, of course, to Roswell to act as the master of ceremonies for the Roswell parades. Of course, Michael Aquino helped make those Roswell parades possible, because Michael Aquino said he was going to make Roswell and basically the new Medjugorje, the new Lourdes, the site of a new American religion that would worship the aliens who brought us technology, little gray aliens with no testicles and no balls. That was his biggest joke of all, and he would laugh about it maniacally whenever he spoke of it. He made a deal, of course, with the elders in the Roswell community that they would say it was extraterrestrials that had died as opposed to Japanese prisoners of war, to boost their economy, because their economy would have dried up and withered away with the closure of the Roswell airfield. And it's very important to remember that the reason an Army PSYOPs expert was involved with the creation of this mythos in cooperation with his co-religionist nuclear physicist, Stanton Friedman, was because, of course, this was an Army issue. There was no Air Force in 1947 at the time that the Roswell atrocity took place.
Well, actually, I'm not so sure about that. You know, there are a couple whistleblowers that have come out just recently. One in particular, of course, is the William Tompkins. I don't know if you've been looking into his disclosures, but he does attest to there being an Air Force. Now, it was called Army Air Force, I believe, initially. And
yeah, that's a lie. It's called the United States Army Air Corps. They would refer to it colloquially as United States Army Air Forces. That's what it would be called. It's not an Air Force. A separate branch of the Air Force did not exist until
however, it was, you know, close enough how it was referred to. But the question becomes, in terms of Roswell, you know, you're citing this information about a plane, a certain kind of a plane that you believe was used was the one that crashed, if I understand you correctly, in Roswell. And so you're saying that that was not an unusual aircraft in any way. You're saying that it didn't have that special Kevlar that they talk about, or whatever it is, the outside of the aircraft. That you would hold in your hand.
Had some very special materials. There were advanced materials by American standards. It's very important to remember how technologically advanced the Axis was. So it was something that was fascinating to people who had seen it on the ground, who were civilians, and various people who found bits and pieces of it. And we could go into the technical details some other time. Certainly I've done so in my presentations, and everyone is recommended to watch, in particular, my DVDs, Roswell and the Rising Sun, which are available through douglasdietrich.com. And the most important point at the moment, just to continue the train of thought as to where we were, probably the first thing to confirm is, of course, the fact that the Army Air Forces were part of the United States Army. It's simply a colloquial reference to them, so it's definitely an Army issue. No jurisdiction was held by the Air Force because it didn't exist at that time over this particular incident or atrocity. So when investigators or journalists approach the United States Air Force, they're even approaching the wrong branch of service concerning this incident. At that time that it took place, it was Roswell Army Airfield.
Okay, so what I want to know is, in terms of what happened, because we know that there was a crash at Corona. We know there have been other crashes, and there have been crashes all over the planet. And these are not all certainly, Japanese, occupied. So what we want to know is, in other words, what was your relationship with Aquino, and where did you see this information? Did you have conversations with him about it? Were you told about it, or did you also see documentation?
Yes, very important. And I brought that up at great length in the past. When it came to the Roswell information, the important thing to realize is that this was the death knell for my appearance on Coast to Coast. I'm going to get back to the original sources of the information and why I was so privy to this, because it's important as to why this wasn't exposed immediately, why this is not something that is general knowledge, why this causes like an immediate denial and shutdown. One of the issues that you brought up is, of course, that there's crashes all over. Now, there's a historical difference in these crashes, and there's a geographic difference. The major difference is that from the period of 1945 through around the late 1950s, through the period of time of around 45 through 55, for about a decade, we have an enormous series of mechanical crashes. These crashes are leaving bodies. The overwhelming majority of them were indeed occupied by Japanese prisoners of war. And this includes Pahrump, Nevada, which was, or Ely, Nevada, excuse me. Pahrump, Nevada was, of course, the home of Art Bell. Ely, Nevada was where some friends of mine lived. That's a very small town, though it's growing. And Ely, Nevada was, of course, a place where we had the 17 body count of about 17 people with a crash that took place in Ely, Nevada. It's where Ansel Adams used to live. And Ansel Adams actually took photographs of the Japanese internment camps that were nearby as well. He was a very famous nature photographer. We had other crashes such as Kingman, Arizona, where even the casual investigators and researchers who published books about Kingman, Arizona, admit that the quote-unquote aliens were speaking English. Of course, like all prisoners of war, the Japanese prisoners of war had to learn the language of their captors. They were speaking English. So throughout that decade, the overwhelming majority of these crashes that were taking place, especially in Kingman, Arizona, where there were two in a row, literally two in a row, within a week. It's obvious these were not extraterrestrial. The rest of the world, we have a very different situation. And
right. Okay. So fair enough. I'm sorry, just to go back on this, but I still want to hear how you know about this. How do you know?
Of course. Yeah. In terms of getting to that, the important thing to emphasize is that my ability to speak about it. Of course, the moment I did address this, just in summary, at a UFO conference, then, of course, it was shut down and I was not allowed on Coast to Coast AM for another half decade. It would be another half decade before I spoke again on Coast to Coast AM.
Okay, well, I'm not allowed on Coast to Coast and haven't been since pretty much the beginning of Camelot for a variety of reasons. I was on there once and they hung up on me. I had a short 15 minutes of fame but when they found out who was on there by accident, it was me. Then they hung up on me, literally.
Yes, there's a method to my madness in bringing this up.
Right.
I remember that interview with you quite distinctly, and the reason that it's important is because, of course, Coast to Coast AM is run by Premier Radio Networks, which, of course, is subsidiary to Clear Channel. Clear Channel is owned by Admiral Bobby Ray Inman. Admiral Bobby Ray Inman is the director of the National Security Agency. Michael Aquino, after he could no longer progress in rank due to the scandals that led to his early retirement from the United States military as a colonel. He did retire as a full bird colonel, ultimately entered via lateral transfer because of his intelligence connections to the National Security Agency, where he is now deputy director. Very important to remember, of course, that like the military, which has multiple generals, there are many generals in the military, there's many deputy directors in the National Security Agency, but one of them is Michael Aquino. However, his boss, the person who he answers to, is Rear Admiral Bobby Ray Inman, and Bobby Ray Inman actually ran the Federal Reserve of Texas, the Texas branch of the United States Federal Reserve for many years. He was, of course, in intelligence. The majority of his resume is classified. And, of course, he was obviously in the United States Navy, where George Norrie was. George Norrie was a public relations officer of the United States Navy for almost a decade.
Yes.
So when George Norrie was a public relations officer, his boss that he answered directly to put the spin as a spin doctor on various events was Admiral Bobby Ray Inman. He still works for Admiral Bobby Ray Inman as the host of Coast to Coast AM. So Michael Aquino and George Norrie answer to the same boss, the NSA director.
That's very interesting information. I'm very aware of Bobby Ray Inman, as a matter of fact, and have been for quite a long time. I actually publicly offered him an interview, knowing, of course, that he would never accept one. but just kind of as a joke. So
to get back to the source,
yeah.
What happened was when I was at the Presidio military base, very important to remember what most people don't comprehend. And this is something that a lot of so-called whistleblowers take advantage of. They take advantage of the ignorance of the American population concerning the corruption, the decadence, the degeneracy, and the incompetence of the United States government, and particularly the United States military. What I worked for when I entered the Department of Defense was a civilian organization. Very important to remember that the United States military, all branches of service, theoretically serve under civilian administration in the United States. And that civilian administration, of course, is the Department of Defense. Now, the DoD, or the Department of Defense, is a department of about 100,000 bureaucrats, the overwhelming majority of who have never seen a day in uniform. So most Americans are unfamiliar with the fact that the Department of Defense people are not subject to the same kind of surveillance that military personnel are. Military personnel, of course, will serve in the United States military. They're under constant supervision, theoretically, of their officers, and have backup systems to make certain that they're obeying security requirements. Most of the time that never happens and nobody pays attention to anything. And within the US DoD, or the Department of Defense civilian sector, it's even worse. So a lot of this had to do with corruption, laziness, and incompetence. My operations manager was someone who never did any work for all intents and purposes. He did some things like check the toner pathologically. He had a kind of habit of checking the toner on the x-ray machine to make certain that I didn't photocopy anything. I was able to escape with many images and many notes at any rate, and there were techniques that I had developed to do that, to take advantage of exactly how the Department of Defense dysfunctioned, did not function. And in terms of one of those techniques that I used to smuggle out also bits and pieces of the Roswell wreckage, I was using the fact that many private corporations, think tanks, such as Research and Development, RAND, MIT, RAND is an acronym for Research and Development,
yes.
And of course the affiliate with MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Many of these civilian corporations have contracts with the Department of Defense. And as a result, there are materials that belong to these corporations that are within Department of Defense facilities. This is so their personnel from these corporations can come in and work with the Department of Defense without having to get DoD officials to travel to their own offices. So because of this, many of the private corporate areas in the library were never investigated. They were never monitored or surveyed. I would take my notes and I would use, basically like white collar theft, basically take them from materials such as note writing material from the private corporations and secure them within the private corporate areas. And then I was able to smuggle them out in that fashion. Now, what had happened was, in particular, when it came to the Roswell incident, we're talking about a time when my operations manager was becoming more reliant on me for doing everything. I had started off basically as a librarian's aide. It was literally a summer job. I became a reference technician, and then ultimately what I became was a Department of Defense librarian as I graduated through higher levels of education. And all of this, you might think, would have some kind of security clearance. The reality is it did not. With seniority comes the clearances. Clearances like my operations manager had. My operations manager had some of the highest level of security clearances just from being a DoD librarian forever. Of course, we had all kinds of contradictory, shall we say, situations, which basically helped to dissemble the integrity of any security within the library at the Presidio military base. One of them was we had a African-American woman who was from the Deep South and had never learned to read and write. And she was the manager of the library over my operations manager, because we had another African-American lady who was also a librarian. She was basically on my level of library status, not the level of the operations manager. Her name was Carolyn Garrett, and she was very proud of her education. She was very, very proud of the fact that she had earned her position. She always referred to the woman who was the manageress, whose name was, oh God, I'm trying to remember now. I do my best to purge these people from my memories. Juanita Taylor. Juanita Taylor was someone who couldn't read or write, and she came over very closely after the World War II era when many 4F blacks were being shipped over en masse as families by Kaiser Industries for the war effort on the Pacific coast. What had happened on the Pacific coast was that many Americans who were European Americans or white Americans had all of the roles in blue-collar industry as firemen, policemen, municipal bus drivers. They all left for the war, and in one way or another wound up involved with the American military. This left much of the industry wide open and in need of labor, so they took many families out of the Deep South that were African American that had no education, and they brought them into the Pacific to work the industries. After the war ended, many of these families basically started working for the government because there's no one else that would have employed them. They didn't have the qualifications. Where they lived was, of course, in Oakland. That was how Oakland, right across the bay from the city of San Francisco, became black, predominantly African American at that time. Tragically, of course, Japantown, Nihonmachi, which was where the Japanese Americans lived, which was 14 square city blocks, sort of like Chinatown was in San Francisco, became emptied. It was just totally denuded of the Japanese because of the internment camp experience. After the war, they, of course, the overwhelming majority of them left the United States. There was no reason for them to stay. Everything had been lost. Everything had been stolen. That'll bring us eventually to the elections and Donald Trump and the involvement with that.
Okay. Now I just want to, sort of slow you down and just clarify. And thank you. It's lovely how well spoken you are. And obviously you have a brain that's like an encyclopedia, so you don't lose the drift, you don't lose detail, and that's lovely. But what I want to do, because I think the listeners might be getting a little bit lost, just to get clarity here, right. Because we are still focused on the Roswell thing. We won't stay here that long, but I just want to make sure we get an answer to the question. So as working for Michael Aquino, and this seems to be something of what you might call a psyop that was started perhaps by Bobby Ray Inman, and then Michael Aquino was also part of it somehow. This, I would imagine, is your premise. And what I'm wondering, and I want to throw this out at you, whether or not you have ever considered that they actually were, that this was another layer of deception, that this actually wasn't, the truth, but that you were fed information or documents or you know what I'm saying?
Understood and appreciated. Of course, that's a desperate ploy that's used very often by many people in the ufological community whose entire careers are based on the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Of course, what I'm dealing with is facts, and it led to enormous changes in the United States, just like the war itself did. When I'm bringing about these demographic changes that led to positions of why certain people were in certain positions who couldn't, who obviously were not qualified or educated for those positions, sheer government inertia and the desire to get people out of the way, put them in positions where they felt they could do the least harm. The logic behind making Juanita Taylor the manager of the overall library was because she couldn't read or write. She was no security threat. She couldn't understand anything that came into the library. But of course, it had its disadvantages because we all had to sign her signature for her. That was eventually how I was able to sign off on many things that I smuggled out of the library. Now, in terms of what happened, of course, with the library itself, the idea that somebody presented a disinformation campaign is beyond ridiculous. They'd have to assume, of course, that I had motivation to share it or to basically exploit it in some fashion or to leak it. There was no known motivation for my doing so that they were aware of.
So at that time, sorry to interrupt, at that time in your life, you were not profiled as someone who would, in essence, go against the establishment to your knowledge, so that you hadn't spoken out in certain ways that then it might attract, et cetera, because we do know that even back in the 1960s, televisions were watching people. There was a certain degree of surveillance. Certainly, if you worked for Aquino and he took an interest in you, as apparently he did, they would have sort of delved into your background in depth and so on and so forth. So what I'm wondering is there any possibility that there could be mind control operating here, and whether or not how your sort of radicalization, if you want to call it that, how you became awake to look for such things? Do you know what I'm saying?
Well, this is very important to emphasize. Michael Aquino, of course, worked very heavily with mind control. And mind control makes people incapable of taking any number of actions. Mind control robs people of volition, and it robs them of initiative. That's certainly not what he wanted with myself, because he viewed myself as his heir apparent to his Temple of Set and the Satanic Chaplaincy of the U.S. military. As such, he wanted somebody who was like him. He thought that I would be that person. And of course, he judged wrong for any number of reasons. But his surveillance of myself began quite early. That much is obvious, certainly the more so as we go on later in life. We're not going to overdwell on that right now as we get back to the source of the Roswell materials. But very important to remember that in terms of programming someone or putting them under mind control, the majority of the time they are left very damaged. They're unable to function. Most importantly of all, they're barely able to articulate. So when you get people who are have suffered mind control, one of the advantages for the controllers is that it's very difficult for the victims to express their victimization. So in terms of the very manner in which I behave, obviously I have not been through a mind control process. We can go through some of the treatments that I underwent in dealing with PTSD later on in life and compare that to your average mind control procedure where people go through traumatic breakdowns and then a reintegration of their personality into fragmented alters. Very different. You have a Frankenstein creation in terms of a persona. You're well aware of that. We'll go into that some other time. But in terms of what happened with Michael Aquino, he really had nothing to do with my sourcing the Roswell materials. This was entirely, quote unquote, an accident. This was based on the fact, of course, that my operations manager was too lazy to do the work. He had the security clearance.
I understand. Okay, but I still, okay, thank you for that part. But the part I'm questioning now is just what motivated you, what triggered you to see, to want to, was it, the fact that your heritage made you look at the way, the Japanese were treated, and therefore you started to become more radicalized in terms of, not taking orders and just without question. Do you know what I'm saying? In other words, there has to be a radicalization of yourself in order to start copying documents secretly with some kind of future objective in mind. You know what I'm saying?
A point well taken. And it's certainly not what many people expect. This is part of the challenge that I deal with when I deal with Americans in terms of qualifying myself, in terms of my heritage. Very important to remember, of course, I was not born in the United States. I was born and acculturated as a Chinese national. Chinese. Very important to emphasize that, not Japanese.
Right.
Very important to remember, of course, that island China, or Taiwan, was, of course, a part of the Japanese Empire for many, many years. And since 1895 through about 1950. And during that period of time, of course, there was much Japanese acculturation. So it was very much a hybrid culture. So the Chinese of Taiwan are heavily Japanized, and in terms of their acculturation and their cultural source points, their navigation point in terms of cultural matrices. So people might identify that as a motivation. The reality was, of course, that what actually motivated me was the sheer corruption and the horrors to which I was witness to in front of my own eyes at the Presidio military base on a daily basis. The fact that, of course, I had grown up certainly being victimized to some level by abuse by my grandfather for a short period of time. It would have been about a year that my family was subject to the area in Walcott, New York, where we lived, to what could be considered a traumatic level of abuse. This resulted, of course, ultimately in my killing my grandfather. And when that happened, of course, it was in self-defense. It was registered at that time as self-defense. But it was an unusual enough situation where I probably came to the attention of somebody at that point, just due to my dad's military background. I probably came to the attention of military intelligence, and around that time probably started being tracked based on a number of experiences I had while going through school when I was younger. And it was probably considered that I would be essentially a good quote unquote house nigger. Now, the reason for this logic is the overwhelming majority of Japanese Americans who have stayed in the United States, and they probably would have qualified me as something bordering on that, even though I'm 1/8 Native American in terms of my bloodline. Tribe of Mandan, where the Standing Rock, they're in the Dakotas, where the Standing Rock situation is developing even now. And in terms of the Mandan tribe, of course, it's one of the areas in which I can certainly say that per the U.S. Census Bureau, I would be considered legally, if I made that claim, a Native American and could live on a reservation. So it's very important to emphasize the fact that I have that tether, that anchor of identity with North America. So I certainly appreciated what they were going through, because when we came into San Francisco was the day that San Francisco was essentially shut down. Certainly the airport was when we entered San Francisco from Taiwan. The airport was shut down during a crisis that was considered an international crisis. The Indians of all tribes, the IAT, had occupied Alcatraz Island and began a Native American colony that they wanted to make independent from the United States, like Taiwan is independent from China, on that island of Alcatraz.
Right.
I very much identified with that movement, just to put that in perspective as to what was going on. Now, in terms of, I'm sorry, what was that?
No, thank you. That was very interesting, that you would have come at that strategic time, and the link up with Alcatraz. Very interesting.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, that had a very important effect on me because of the child molestation involved. Just as a quick tangent there, because I do believe it's important, the man responsible for the Indian colony on Alcatraz Island was Richard Oakes, the Mohawk. He was of a Mohawk nationality. He was my hero at a very young age. I saw him. He had been educated at San Francisco State University, which had caused me to go to San Francisco State University later in life for about a year, where I majored in political ideology based on my hero at that time, Richard Oakes the Mohawk. And Richard Oakes the Mohawk was someone who was responsible for the Indians of all tribes, which was an organization of what was known as a Red Power movement. Now, because I was, in my grandfather's case, he viewed both my sister and myself, in whom the Native American bloodline appeared very strongly. We looked very different from any other Dietrich in my father's extended family, who all looked, of course, very European American, very Caucasoid. But in our case, we looked very Native American. And so we weren't really considered as part of the family. And because of that, of course, there was abuse from my grandfather, who mostly took it out on my sister with his rapes. And he had had a history of this with the rest of the Dietrich children during the time that he had been raising them, apparently. And or conclusively, from what I found out later from family members. Now, when he tried to assault myself, he tried to rape myself orally, and that's when I tore his penis off with my teeth, which was just coming in at the age of 3. And that, of course, killed him. It led him to bleed to death within a matter of about 48 hours, probably a day or two he lingered. But of course, we left for San Francisco at that point. We broke off all ties with the rest of my father's extended biological family. And when he did try to rape me, the first thing he did say, which I do remember even at the age of 3, because he had been calling my sister that, was, "Come over here, you dirty little redskin." So when I came to San Francisco, it was no better. I was always either verbally or physically assaulted as a Native American. So when the Indians occupied Alcatraz, I very much related to them. And the man who, of course, their leader was Richard Oakes the Mohawk, who had his own daughter, who was barely 13 years of age when she was ultimately murdered. And what happened was, when he organized what he did on Alcatraz Island, he unfortunately held several powwows where he welcomed other Red Power organizations such as AIM, or the American Indian Movement, which became infamous for being heavily infiltrated by the United States government. Now, what makes all of this the more tragic, and of course, as a Department of Defense librarian whose responsibility was on site, the El Presidio Real de San Francisco, the Presidio military base, I had access to all of these documents and records proving this. The United States Army still operated under the orders of the Frontier Army. The frontier, of course, was legally declared no longer a frontier in shortly before World War I, around 1917 or so. And what had happened was the United States Army, however, was still under orders to exterminate all Indians. That order had never been rescinded. Most Americans were entirely unaware of this. It still was legal during the time of President Richard Nixon, who was president at that time. And President Richard Nixon was confronted with this incredible challenge on Alcatraz because the Native Americans were declaring themselves independent of the United States, that this would be an island Native America from which they could ask for the majority of their lands to be returned on the basis of the Treaty of Fort Laramie and perhaps even the Royal Proclamation of the 1700s, going back to any number of documents along the trail of broken treaties. Now, immediately, they were considered for recognition by the Soviet Union and Japan and the People's Republic of China. At that period of time, if Nixon had used the military, the San Francisco Presidio military base was right on site. He could have invaded with the United States military. He did not. He had to refrain from doing so because to do so would have been considered a military invasion of a sovereign nation. And that would have involved him in a war with the Soviet Union, the Empire of Japan, and the People's Republic of China at that time, who were very seriously considering the recognition of Native America on the island of Alcatraz. So as a result, he had to invade with San Francisco County SWAT teams, FBI agents, various paramilitary units. And when he did so, he could only do so after depriving the Native Americans of their leadership on Alcatraz. This was done, of course, by a Native American infiltrating their ranks from the American Indian movement, and who had stayed over after one of their powwows with AIM. And this individual murdered the daughter of Richard Oakes the Mohawk. She was 13 years of age when she was found raped and murdered on the island. That broke his heart. He left the island. Then they were ripe for invasion, and that's when the Americans invaded on what they called Redskin Rock Day. And of course, it was found out none of the Native Americans had any firearms or any means of defense. And of course, they were all taken to the mainland. A number of the Braves escaped, and they took over a missile installation that was in the hills of Monterey and various other hills around the San Francisco Greater Bay Area region. They took over various military installations, and that's when the Army was sent in because they were on United States soil. The Army was deployed from the Presidio military base at that time and wiped out the last of the Braves that had rebelled against the United States. At that period of time, Richard Oakes the Mohawk was murdered ultimately himself. He was shot in the brain by a child molester, a known pedophile who was famous in the YMCA as an employee who openly and repeatedly raped Native American boys. And this individual who shot Richard Oakes the Mohawk in the brain basically put him into a coma, which he didn't revive from until a Native American medicine doctor was brought in to heal him, at which point, of course, shortly after that, he was murdered by somebody else. But the child molester who basically put him in the coma never spent a day in jail. He was lauded by the Americans for putting down a communist revolt, as they classified it. All of this was my version of the Kennedy assassination. Americans are entirely unfamiliar with this assassination at all. They know all about Martin Luther King Jr. They know all about Bobby Kennedy and John F. Kennedy. They even know about white nationalist identity movement leaders like George Lincoln Roswell being assassinated, or black supremacists or separatists like Malcolm X. Nobody knows about Richard Oakes the Mohawk. The entire story was covered up, and the child molester who murdered him was considered a hero. This is the kind of America I grew up in. You can't expect me to have any affiliation or identity with the concept of being an American. I was always considered a foreigner, whether as a Native American or as an Asian. But what they were operating on within the U.S. military-industrial complex was the thought that I would be a good house nigger, an Indian scout, something along the lines of your average Nisei American. What happened in the case of most Japanese Americans during internment was that they cooperated with the United States. They tried to prove they were good Americans. They tried to prove that they were white. They took the highest rate of casualties in all of the U.S. Armed Forces, and they wound up with more Congressional Medals of Honor awarded to them than any other unit in terms of the Gopher Baroque Squadron and these various other Japanese American units. And I think of them as race traitors and fools. because these people ultimately receive no benefits. And you see the best example of them intellectually in people like Francis Fukuyama, who declared America the victor of the Cold War and that history had come to an end, in the terms of Michio Kaku, who, of course, was a nuclear physicist producing weapons for the United States government, and then, of course, is popularized as a science popularizer. There's many other cases where you've got Lon Horiuchi, who is a Japanese American who worked for the FBI, and he was willing to kill a white American woman and child. He shot Randy Weaver's wife while she was holding up an infant son from the back between his shoulder blades to show what a good American he was. These are the kind of Japanese Americans I despise, but they thought I was one of them. That's why I was entrusted to do what they called the nigger work, the gopher work. And so when they were too lazy to do something, they put it on myself, and they thought of myself as a good nigger. And for that reason, it was never suspected I would turn anything over.
All right. Well, thank you. That's very eloquent, and I appreciate that. If I'm not mistaken, I don't think you named the person who murdered the Mohawk person that you were mentioning. I'm sorry. The name being again. Is
Michael Myers, something like that? I've done my best
Richard
to purge him
Oakes, the Mohawk he was murdered by this person, but you didn't actually name. Okay, that's okay. We can
I've done my best
up.
to purge his name from my memory because I get so violently ill whenever I think back on it. Right. But he's easy to look up.
I appreciate that. Okay, I just wanted to check. All right, so taking everything from this point, you did have a motivation then to secret out documents. And you don't believe you're mind controlled. So you believe that you came across accurate documents about the Roswell situation. And somehow you got information also about Stanton Friedman. I don't want to prolong this too much longer, but I do want to ask, what were there documentation about Stanton Friedman, or how did you become aware of his role in this cover-up that involved Roswell? I know he wrote a book, but I'm not talking about that. I'm actually talking about what you referred to as he must have had knowledge, if indeed, because he is a person who's written a book investigating Roswell, coming from a point of view that it could be ETs. And there's also Colonel Corso, who also wrote a book in this regard, and with Bill, I forget his last name, Burns. And so these individuals, one would think, especially Stanton Friedman, the way you've referred to him, you indicate that he had prior knowledge or knowledge that he was part of a cover-up. Is that true? I mean, is that what you're claiming? And if so, how do you know this?
The important thing to remember about the Roswell atrocity is that there are two major areas of division. In terms of Stanton Friedman, he would know he was part of a cover-up simply because he took part in the cover-up. He would know almost nothing about the Japanese prisoners of war. So all he was doing was cooperating with Michael Aquino. Now, in all fairness, according to the documents that I saw, they did have a handle on him in the sense of leverage. And this was the fact that apparently he had a daughter, a granddaughter, somebody who was under his responsibility, who was a young lady who apparently was developmentally disabled. And so there were threats involved in his direction in getting him to cooperate, as well as promises of reward. That much I do know from the documents that I saw. And in terms of his ultimately relocating to Canada, it served a double purpose, not only because the United States itself was so irradiated by so much of what he had been involved with the Convair MBH-36 experiment, but also the fact that he could get his daughter medical care very inexpensively based on Canada's socialized medicine. So it was these two reasons he became a Canadian citizen. So in terms of what he knew about Roswell before then, it wasn't even an issue. It was just what he was ordered to promote about Roswell, which was that it was an extraterrestrial background. In the case of Philip J. Corso, there's several important distinctions to be made. We had Simon Parks recently make some statements about Max Spears, and Simon Parks was on Ghost Spirit or Wolf Spirit Radio Network.
Yes.
Wolf Spirit Radio Network was run by David Corso, and David Corso was a cousin of Philip J. Corso. I got to know David Corso very well before his death. David Corso actually raised genuine wolves. I mean, these weren't just half-breed wolves or hybridized wolves. These were like wolves that were almost 100% wolf.
Yes, I went to his house to interview him and Duncan O'Finian, and I met his wolves in person. Yes.
Yes, thank you. And I always had a deep affection for him. He himself claimed to be one of the original generations, probably the first wave of super soldiery, which means he was basically a super victim, as so many of these people are, who are quote unquote super soldiers, very much super victims in so many ways. And he agreed with what I had said about Philip J. Corso and reconfirmed all of my impressions. Philip J. Corso, of course, was someone who basically was in the United States Army Reserves. He was active during the Second World War. During that period of time, of course, he acted as a liaison, as I did with the Department of Defense, between various officers. So I did a lot of running around and was exposed to quite a bit. And so he wrote a book ultimately called I Walked with Giants, which was about these various, shall we say, operations in intercommunications between the chiefs of staff of Europe, the European theater of war, and World War II in particular. Now, Bill Burns came in, and Bill Burns, of course, has a legal background. He's extraordinarily educated. He's got multiple degrees. He becomes involved with ufology, and he is almost certainly involved with the United States government just based on his behavior. And we're going to have to leave it at that in the sense of the speculation as to his involvement, but it's certainly proved out by his behavior. Basically, he got together with Philip J. Corso, who had claimed to be a Space Brothers type of experiencer. Philip J. Corso had claimed that he had met aliens that were advocating peace. And so Philip J. Corso wanted to write about that. Now, it was around this period of time that I was creating an international scandal with what was going on with what I exposed with the Roswell incident. And this is very important to outline all of this. When I started leaking the information on Roswell and turning over a great deal of the parts that I had to Japan through Teleport USA. Teleport USA worked with a lot of currencies exchange in Los Angeles. It was headquartered in Los Angeles. And at the time I was working with Teleport USA with a number of members of their staff. Then what had happened was much of these materials were turned over because they were building the Hakui City Roswell Memorial Museum in Hakui City, Japan. Hakui City is located on the island of Japan, facing Korea in the Sea of Japan, very small fishing town. And it's spelled H-A-K-U-I in the romanization, Hakui City. The Japanese expended some $60 to $90 million in this museum. And this was going to be the version of a Holocaust memorial museum in memory to the Japanese prisoners of war who died in the United States. The FBI began investigating, and of course that's a domestic agency, and the reason they were investigating was because they were trying to find out who had leaked the information, which would have been myself. And they showed up in Japan, began to investigate this. During this period of time that I was dealing with the Japanese, what happened was Art Bell was sent the same kind of parts that I had been sent. They were called Art's parts. So during that period of time, Art Bell received this box full of parts that were basically Japanese aluminum, as pointed out by Linda Moulton Howe, who took them for a spectrography test. And the spectrometer was able to analyze the metal and prove that it was terrestrial World War II era Japanese aluminum. It was the same materials I had.
Right.
He was sent them by the U.S. Army as part of a DISFO campaign. And they sent them with a letter saying that this all had to do with aliens. So when Art Bell was dealing with this, and Linda Moulton Howe ultimately brought it to a conclusion where it was quite anticlimactic for most Americans, they didn't know what to make of it, so they just looked at it as a hoax, but it served its purpose as a diversion and as a disinformation campaign from what I was doing with the Japanese. At that same time, we were coming up on the 49th anniversary of Roswell. Now, the Japanese were going to open up this museum in time that year, or for the 50th or half-century mark of Roswell, in around 1997. So Bill Burns pressured Philip J. Corso and said, look, you were in the military, you worked with the Pentagon, you had these security clearances, nobody wants to read about space brothers wanting peace. Let's write a book about Roswell. And so they wrote a book about Roswell that is loaded with several things that are quite inaccurate. We could go into the technical details of that later, claiming that there was technologies that sourced from this. That's gone into my DVD, again, through DouglasDietrich.com. But the reality was the manner in which he tried to promote the book. Bill Burns talked Philip J. Corso into complying with him, and they approached Senator Strom Thurmond. And Strom Thurmond had been around forever, and they asked him to write the introduction or the preface to the book I Walked with Giants about Philip J. Corso's World War II experiences. And he said, yes, of course, I'd be honored. He wrote that, and Bill Burns took it and stuck it as the introduction for the day after Roswell. Now, Strom Thurmond was so outraged and scandalized, he sued. And so Bill Burns had to withdraw every single one of these books, of which they had already published and circulated thousands throughout Barnes & Noble and various bookstores at the book. And he had to withdraw all of them, was able to do it in 2 weeks and get it republished in time for the 49th anniversary of Roswell on the 1st of July through the 7th of July in 1996. No one man has the resources to do that. That had the government.
Okay. Well, yes, I'm going to break in here because I have had very few dealings at all. I do think I did meet Bill Burns briefly. He used to be head of the UFO Congress in the very early days, and I know some back channel stories about him. So I will suffice to say that, yes, I mean, he probably has heavy duty intelligence connections, if not, is working with them. So yes, I mean, that's
need
obvious.
To emphasize some other aspect of this because it is important and it does show us where this was coming from. Bill Burns, of course, he severed his relations with Philip J. Corso in great acrimony because after that book was published, Philip J. Corso said, well, now let's write the book on the Space Brothers wanting peace. And Bill Burns said no. And they severed in acrimony, and Philip J. Corso was very embittered, and he died a bitter old man, never able to get his Space Brothers book out, is saying he had been exploited by Bill Burns. He had essentially been pimped out by him and victimized. But beyond that, Bill Burns set up an interview with myself on his future radio network with his wife, Nancy Burns. And this is on record because they were interviewing the granddaughter of the Betty and Barney Hill. And the granddaughter of Betty and Barney Hill was the week before the interview they had scheduled with myself. And on that interview with the granddaughter of Betty and Barney Hill, they referred to myself as a Jap. And they said, Doug Dietrich is a Jap. And he says, the Japs were at Roswell. And we're going to prove otherwise when we interview him and all this other shit. It was just this incredibly racist, vile remarks. So I canceled my interview with them for what I feel should be obvious and understandable reasons. And Nancy Burns ultimately did send me an emailed apology, which was just ridiculous, of course. These people insult people in public and they apologize in private. So of course, nothing ever came of that. I certainly didn't accept her apology. But I maintained the email, of course, as documentary evidence of what had gone down, as well as it's on record. It's on audio record, of course, with their interview with the granddaughter of Betty and Barney Hill. But this shows which direction they're coming from. See, the problem is that Asian Pacific Islander Americans or Amerasians like myself are such a minority that people get away with saying these racist remarks all the time, and they get used to it, and they feel they can do this with impunity and without repercussion. But it's very important to bring this up, not because it offended my sensibilities, but because it showed the direction from which they were coming from in terms of any open-mindedness to the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation was that the United States Army, the commandant of the Presidio military base, wanted the Roswell files to work with for whatever reasons. I was never given the reasons for that. I suspect it had something to do with investigating Michael Aquino, because these are the two major chronological differences between what happened with the atrocity and then Michael Aquino's disinformation campaign was exactly what was going on with Roswell as an atrocity committed against prisoners of war, and then Roswell as an alien extraterrestrial disinformation campaign. But in terms of what happened with the world as a result of Hockley City Memorial Museum, the Americans, of course, struck back. While the Art Bell disinformation campaign was going on with Art's Parts, the United States Army in particular, its high command, and many retired officers and generals were deeply alarmed that Japan would open this museum up, and they approached their executive commander-in-chief, William Jefferson Clinton. William Jefferson Clinton responded by imposing the most severe trade restrictions against Japan. He revoked all of their trade benefits with the United States open market, which had been opened by the Second World War. And he imposed upon the Japanese an incredible incentive to divest in the United States. Until that period of time, 1995, the Japanese were investing very heavily in the United States. Japanese industries were providing people jobs throughout the United States. At that period of time when Clinton struck back, even to the point of saying we're not going to have Japanese manufactured light bulbs on the Washington Christmas tree in Washington, D.C. at the White House. And since they couldn't find any Christmas bulbs that weren't manufactured in Japan, they lit candles that year instead on the White House Christmas tree. All of this was part of what insulted Japan and forced their divestiture from the United States, where they revested in communist China, and they basically rearranged their entire economy from manufacturing consumers' goods to producing manufacturers' goods or producers' goods. In other words, they started producing assembly lines for the Chinese and sending the Chinese managers for their industrial revolution. And that's what started the Made in China boom. All of this happened because of what I was leaking with Roswell. These leaks have enormous international consequences.
Sure.
And they led to the massive depression that occurred in the United States because of Japanese divestiture. They led to the incredibly increased quality of life in communist China and its ultimate road to capitalism, not because of Deng Xiaoping, but because of Japanese investment making it possible. So all of this changed the world as we know it. So the fact that people are able to ignore what happened because of my expositions is beyond the scope of comprehension. But a lot of it has to do with, of course, very few venues being like Project Camelot. Now, to finally clarify again the source of my information for Roswell, the Presidio Commandant was probably investigating Michael Aquino's background because of leaks concerning allegations of child abuse that was going on at the child daycare center. And he was probably interested in who had been in charge of the Roswell campaign for disinformation, wanted to find out where things could go wrong if Michael Aquino wound up somehow being prosecuted. And as a result, they ordered the Roswell files from what many Americans refer to as Area 51, or Tonopah Army Airfield, as it was originally. Again, important to remember, in 1947 was not an Air Force base. Today, of course, it is an Air Force base that is in condominium in co-administration with the Central Intelligence Agency. Both agencies, both the branch of service of the Air Force and the agency of the CIA, being established in 1947, the year of the Roswell atrocity. And when they took over Tonopah Army Airfield, it was specifically, in many respects, to hide the realities of that atrocity and to keep that in lockdown.
When you call it an atrocity, and I really do want to move on after this, but yes. When we call, or you call it an atrocity, my understanding is that it was an aircraft that was shot down. It was actually caught on some kind of radar, and it was during, maybe I have this mixed up with another crash, but you know, I was never a big fan. Let me clarify this. Understood. For the listener. I was never a big fan of the Roswell crash. For some reason, on an intuitive level, it never resonated with me, you know, unlike other things that I investigate. So I haven't ever gone a lot into depth there. So recently I have been looking. I'm going to have a very interesting guest next week, Walter Bosley, who's going to be talking to some degree about something he investigated with regard to Roswell because of something he happened to his father. And Walter Bosley is someone who investigates the Templars. He's actually, he was a member of the Air Force OSI. And so he's an investigator by trade who has retired from that and is a writer exclusively, to my knowledge now. A very interesting man, very interesting writer, very, very principled individual in my estimation. At any rate, because of that, I do have a few bits and pieces about Roswell that I'm finding quite interesting, things that don't fit and things that also don't fit with the William Tompkins recent revelations that have been coming out in his interviews, some of which I've been able to see. The others are you have to pay for them on Gaiam. So I'm trying to get an interview with him, needless to say. So at this time, what I wanted to ask you is basically in terms of the overall Roswell situation, are you feeling that there was purpose behind the crash? Unbeknownst to me, what you're thinking, that it was not an accidental crash, that it was a shoot down. Are you saying it was a because you're saying, in other words, are you saying because the Japanese prisoners of war were not voluntarily manning that spacecraft? How are you couching this?
Thank you. Let's go over that in as quick a summary as possible. Bear in mind, this requires context. It always does. Such realities, historical realities, they can't be synthesized in a soundbite. So this is going to take a few moments. Basically, the important thing to contextualize is that the United States and the Empire of Japan were still legally at war in 1947. The Americans, of course, always cite that there was a ceremony on the Missouri. There's nothing that happened on the Missouri that had any legal consequences recognized by any government of the world. That was a circus. They literally sold circus tickets to the Missouri ceremony. The Japanese officers and diplomats had no samurai swords to surrender. There was a backwards flag that wasn't even an American flag that had originally belonged to Commodore Perry, that the Japanese demanded be put on the side of the hull to show that they had closed that circle of violence that had been opened by Commodore Perry under a series of lies. That in itself was a part in negating any legality as recognized by the Americans in terms of that circus ceremony. Per the Title 38 of the United States Code, which is law as established by Congress, the ceasefire for World War II, the ceasefire, the proactive prosecution of hostilities coming to a ceasefire under terms of agreement, did not happen until December 31st of 1946. The same with the Code of Federal Regulations as benefits that offers to World War II veterans. So the United States government obviously, legally, does not recognize the Battleship Missouri as a surrender ceremony. Since this is law, technically, as with the Holocaust denial law in Europe, if any American claims it was, theoretically, they could be arrested should the U.S. government desire to pursue that. That's how important this is in defining this as law. And the Code of Federal Regulations is the equivalent to executive orders. That's how serious this is. And the Japanese-American Peace Treaty was signed on-site the Presidio military base in 1951. It was September 28th of 1951, and it came into effect on the birthday eve day of Emperor Hirohito in honor of him, on August 28th of 1952. So until August 28th of 1952, the United States and Japan were legally at war under conditions of ceasefire. This doesn't justify atrocities committed against prisoners of war, but the prisoners of war that were in the United States were still legally under legally under American purview as prisoners of war. And they did not need to return them until 1952. But by that time, they were all dead. So the Americans had this long-running atrocity going on with the murder of their Asian Pacific Islander prisoners of war. Now, in terms of that period of time, of course, what was going on was that the Japanese could fit into these crafts. This is very important for Americans to remember. Your average American was literally twice the size physically of your average Japanese. The Japanese people are vegetarian historically. Throughout thousands of years, they ate nothing but fish and vegetables. They did not eat meat. So the Americans, of course, are big beef eaters. The Americans died, along with all Allied prisoners of war from Europe. All European and American prisoners of war died at 7 times the rate in Japanese prisoner of war camps that they died in National Socialistische or Nazi prisoner of war camps, because Japanese would give them, by United Nations at that time, international agreement. The United Nations was extant. The Japanese were obviously not a member. They were at war with the United Nations, but they obeyed the Geneva Convention, and they would give their prisoners about half of what their own troops ate in the field. That, of course, because all of them were vegetarians who were diminutive in size, and literally like half the poundage of your average American would be like giving an American nothing to eat. So most of these Allied prisoners were starved to death, even under legal convention as upheld by the Japanese. So this is how different they were physically. And most Americans had never seen Japanese or Chinese. And so you had a situation when the Japanese bodies were misidentified. We can articulate that in that context with many other details. But in terms of the craft being destroyed, the hypothesis or the fabrication that's offered by many ufologists is that radar somehow impacted the ability of these aliens that were extraterrestrials that were able to travel for light years and then somehow get all jammed up by a local terrestrial radar and then wind up crashing. That, of course, is absurd. The story from Stanton Friedman himself is that two separate space planes coming from light years apart came into the North American continental region and crashed into each other, which is some extraordinarily bad piloting. They'd have to be like two teenagers who had stolen their daddy's hot rocket spaceships and collided with each other while playing chicken. It's that absurd.
Well, there is one aspect to this which has to do with going interdimensional. When a craft comes out of going interdimensional, it does materialize rather suddenly. And my understanding is that once a craft does materialize in our atmosphere, it is subject to the laws of what goes on planet Earth in terms of physics. And therefore, it could have been subject to such things as radar. That it wouldn't have necessarily been a subject to, of course, if it was interdimensional. But once again, it materializes. That's my understanding of that premise. Now, the other thing as far as things colliding, I do know one of the things that happens when you go interdimensional is estimating where you're going to come out at is very difficult. So I do get this from various whistleblowers. So I'm not sure, I appreciate what you're saying. I just don't, I obviously in your premise, this is not an issue because it's not extraterrestrial. So maybe discussing the physics of it is sort of a moot point. But I just wanted to say that in terms of what I
do want to reinforce what you're saying. The physics of the other dimensions is based on what the United States government was studying on the basis of time travel, where they believe much of the ufological phenomena, which has been coeval or parallel the human experience, has been sourcing from is our descendants in the future. And they do feel that basically it's important to remember that time, like space, is the fourth dimension. So when you're going from a fourth dimension into a third dimension, then of course you've got a situation where there's no reason for them to materialize in the sense that people are trying to rationalize with the ufological community in order to justify a crash. Basically, what has happened is the United States government has fired at certain phenomenon that are basically shadows. When we are over a two-dimensional plane, such as a wall, such as the ground, we are three-dimensional and we cast two-dimensional shadows. We can take a firearm and fire at our shadow. It's not going to cause any damage to us. It's the same as when these various phenomena manifest out of a fourth dimension. And that's why they're morphing shape and they're changing so radically. It's obviously not mechanical in the sense of the crashes that were going on throughout America during that period from 1945 through 1956. What you have instead with what's going on with these other phenomena is something that's a shadow out of the fourth dimension. You can fire at it and it will do no damage to that shadow. The shadows never fully manifest or solidify into something that would be like somehow you or I somehow becoming two-dimensional. We don't have that capability or the desire to suddenly flatten ourselves and become two-dimensional because we would have no use to ourselves as two-dimensional beings. So in terms of these phenomena that are in the fourth dimension, they're not entering the third dimension. Aspects of them are manifesting, which are unassailable by third dimensional technologies or physical objects.
All right, well, that's a very interesting statement. Okay, but at this point, we have limited time, and I would like to, delve into that deeper because it is a physics question that I've gotten other explanations for, and I appreciate yours. Sounds perfectly logical in many ways. So, but can we get back to just to kind of close this down really quickly? This idea that there was these prisoners of war were used as pilots in this craft.
And they killed themselves.
And
what had happened was the unconventional craft that they were in was a composite craft. This was in context of the failure of Operation Highjump. Whether your average American or Westerner believes it or not means absolutely nothing, because all of their tax dollars, if they're a United States citizen, go to a military junta, which for all intents and purposes operates the United States government. And that military junta did believe, for any number of reasons, they knew the National Socialist High Command had relocated to Antarctica. Operation Highjump was an action on the part of the United States Navy, a very ad hoc task force to try and contend with this issue, which failed miserably. That's when the responsibility went to the United States Army to prove itself. The United States Army had possession of these Japanese prisoners of war and unconventional aircraft that had been authorized to surrender themselves at Tonopah Army Airfield, carrying biological weapons which could be analyzed by the United States, so they could realize that Emperor Hirohito, a marine biologist of worldwide repute, had devised through Unit 731 to force the Americans into negotiations. This is, of course, why Eisenhower and then Truman first and then Eisenhower were known to be in communications or talk-down processes with quote-unquote aliens. These are, of course, manifested as extraterrestrials within disinformation campaigns like Dark Skies, the TV series. Reality, of course, it was the Japanese who they were still legally at war with. And of course, their agreements were to open American markets, etc. All of this resulted in an enormously higher quality of life for the Japanese people. For the Americans, of course, it was the death of their industries. But during this period of time, while those negotiations were still ongoing, the talk-down processes between Truman and then Eisenhower and the Japanese, what you had was the Americans trying to take care of the National Socialistes relocating to Antarctica, in the very same sense that the Nationalist Republic of China escaped the mainland with the American-supported communist victory and relocated to the island of Taiwan. So as a result, the National Socialistes' relocation to Antarctica was obviously unassailable by conventional weaponry as deployed by the United States Navy. The Americans wanted to deploy atomic weaponry. Their best bet was to use the Japanese unconventional aircraft, which had been designed to evade radar. The dirigible system, which was an enormous aero dreadnought, was able to fly at very high altitudes, is stratospherically for all intents and purposes. And this is why the men wore oxygen masks, various other containment suits, and of course looked very extraterrestrial. And then, of course, they would drop the plane that was carried beneath them that was on a catapulted hangar system, and they would drop that, and that would fly underneath the radar system. It was meant to glide beneath such. The German radar had devastated Operation Highjump. The Americans found it so effective they based their dew line in the Arctic up in the northern Canadian regions on the National Socialistes radar installations that were in the Antarctic continent. And
when you're referring to, just to clarify, appreciate that. When you're referring to the National Socialistes, you're really talking about the Nazis.
Yes, Nazi is, of course, a derogatory term. It's a pejorative. It's a propaganda term, and it's not academically viable. It's not something that that really sits well, I think, with a historical discussion. So yes, the Nazi relocation to Antarctica.
Just to clarify that for the listeners.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so in essence, what you're, to sort of, distill down what you're basically saying. You're basically saying is that these were prisoners of war, that the craft itself was taken down
by themselves. They self-immolated because, of course, this was an opportunity for them to do so. The Americans literally could not fit in these craft, just as your average American could not fit inside of a Japanese tank. Just as your average American could not enter your average Japanese bunker. Your average American couldn't fit.
Okay. But why crash it themselves? I'm still not quite getting that point.
Oh, because they were being tortured incessantly. And of course, this was an escape. This was an opportunity for themselves to escape. Japanese prisoners of war traditionally commit suicide in captivity. A great example of this is the book Japanese Prisoners of War in Revolt. There is a book by that title. Japanese Prisoners of War in Revolt talks about the Australian experience in which many Japanese prisoners were brought to Australia. They were almost overwhelmingly brought unconscious. They had either bled out so profusely that they were unable to resist and were literally comatose, or they were unconscious because of skull injuries, etc. and they were transported to Australia, set up in Australian internment camps. When they all resuscitated or reawoke in mass, they would charge the machine guns and wrap themselves in barbed wire until they bled out or were machine gunned to death. Every single prisoner in Australia died in that manner, hundreds and hundreds of them, to the point where the Australians were so impressed they allowed Emperor Hirohito's son, Akihito, Prince Akihito, to visit Australia so he could pay his respects to all of the Japanese prisoners of war who had sacrificed themselves in that regard. The Japanese in America were much better monitored. They were isolated in cells where they had no weapons to destroy themselves with. The Americans, however, were unable to control them once they were inside of the aircraft. They could self-destruct easily because the Americans had never been able to get inside the aircraft to dismantle any self-destruct mechanisms.
Okay.
So when the Japanese
I understand. Okay,
yeah.
Thank you. So at this point, what I want to do, and thank you for all of that, it's really fascinating stuff. And, I can't say I can, agree with everything you said, but I think it all sounds very, very, very well put together. And I think it does make some logical sense if one goes back through history. So at the moment, what I'd like to do is kind of make a turn here.
Yes.
There are a lot of people that are interested in how you might connect the Trump presidency at this moment to everything that you know and understand about the occult, et cetera, et cetera. And so do you want to go there? Are you willing to?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's very important to emphasize several facts about the Trump presidency. We're entering what are potentially very dangerous times and what are potentially very positive times. It's positive for the world in many respects. It's negative for Americans in ways I don't believe that they've even come to comprehend. Donald Trump, it must be remembered, there has been a lot of shall we say, rumors about the Bush dynasty and their relations to Germans. The overwhelming majority of European Americans are of German background of one sort or another. Very important to remember that the Germans were looked on as the immigration wave that was despised by the founding fathers during the time of the founding fathers who set up the Electoral College, which brought us Donald Trump. The founding fathers were referring to all the German emigres as basically a kind of white nigger or European undesirable. They viewed themselves as white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who were pure of race in what they believed to be a superior culture. And the founding fathers, of course, looked on many of the German immigrants as little better than slaves. And many of them were sold on auctioning blocks along with African Americans. Many white people were Irish, etc. Just as many Germans and Italians were interned along with Japanese during the internment process of the Second World War, which again brings us to part of the suggestions by Donald Trump in terms of internment. So we have a situation which has brought us back full cycle. But in terms of the founding fathers, important to remember that at that period of time, they set up the Electoral College because they were conquering a continent. The American Revolutionary War of Independence was instigated because King George of Britain was a civilized man who had drawn out the Royal Proclamation of the 1700s. And he said, thus far and no further along the line of the Appalachian Mountains. He said, the Native Americans have a continent. We will trade with the Native Americans through the French. The French have married many Native Americans. They operate as traders, and they've done so for generations. They have outposts and a network and a constellation of merchant outposts by which you can trade forevermore. And it's time to draw the line, and the Americans must stop expanding and stop killing Indians. And the American founding fathers wanted nothing to do with that. They wanted the continent from sea to shining sea. They wanted it all to themselves. So they declared the Revolutionary War of Independence, the longest declared war in American history prior to the advent of the Second World War, which, of course, as I said, was under legal declaration for what amounted to the Americans for about over a decade. And so we had this situation where the founding fathers ran a war which lasted about 8 years. Now, what this was a conservative insurgency, conservative in the sense that the founding fathers had something to conserve. They were white, plantation-owning, slave-owning men. And of course, they wanted a world in which they could control property. The original Declaration of Independence said, for life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Now, since the majority of their serfs, the American colonists, were just people who were working on the field and had no property, there was nothing there to appeal to them to fight for the founding fathers at all. So the founding fathers said pursuit of happiness, and they changed it to that. Now, eventually, of course, they said, well, when we expand into this interior, we have all of these colonists who are going to barely populate these areas over vast tracts of land. And what are they going to do to keep them in connection with our government, to keep it centralized? Well, basically, taxation without representation was the purported rationale for the American Revolutionary War of Independence. So to prevent taxation without representation, the Founding Fathers developed the Electoral College. And the Electoral College, of course, enables underpopulated areas to vote and still have a say in the outcome of the election. That means something. So if you got rid of the Electoral College, which was suggested when the vote for Al Gore was stolen. Now, this is no way, shape, or form to promote Al Gore. Al Gore was obviously insane. He declared he had invented the internet, which was absurd, of course. It was invented by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And of course, he's no better or worse than George Bush Jr. They were both just horrible people and horrible examples of subgrade morons in their own right, figureheads, empty suits. But in terms of George Bush Jr., the election was undeniably stolen, hanging by a chad by his brother, Jeb Bush. And the Electoral College was abused in order to steal that election. Now, that happened again now with Hillary Clinton. And again, I despise both of these people equally. I'm a political atheist when it comes to domestic politics. Hillary Clinton is somebody who's horrible. Podesta, for instance, who was her campaign manager, is now involved with what's known as Pizzagate, which, of course, I've been shouting about in terms of child molestation and the pedophilicry for decades. So it almost bemuses me, but rather certainly irritates me no end, that people are finally now beginning to focus on the pedophilicry, the fact that the majority of their governance is governed by child molesters. And give an example of this, the Dozier Dig in the Dozier School for Boys in Florida, which was an institution where they reformed young boys, has a gravesite with about 100 shallow graves for young boys that were raped to death in the Dozier School for Boys, or killed when they wouldn't cooperate with being pimped out. The book that is written about these young boys is titled The White House Boys, because so many of them were pimped out to the White House and various politicians involved with the United States government. This has been a tradition for quite some time, is how everybody keeps each other in check. And in terms of Hillary Clinton, certainly Podesta is apparently involved in this sort of activity, to the point where my Executrix producer looked up the time he was in Spain. He was in Portugal, in all fairness, where they have a very tight restriction on legal age of sex in Portugal. But they were hours away across the border from Spain, where Spain, of course, has a legal age of consent of 13 years. You can have sex with anyone who's over 13 years old or 13 years of age if they give you consent in Spain. And what happened was some British young lady who was, I forget her name, but she was abducted, disappeared at a time when the Podesta brothers were both within hours of her disappearance in terms of distance. And the police descriptions, the police sketches that were given by all witnesses who abducted this young girl, who was never seen again, directly match the Podesta brothers. It's a description of the Podesta brothers. So the Podesta brothers may well have been guilty of abducting and raping to death or torturing to death some young girl who is a Briton, a British citizen, who was abducted in Spain, where she might have been taken back to Portugal. Now, all of this is explosive. No one is paying attention to it. This is the horror of the people who ran the political action committee of Hillary Clinton. These are the people behind her campaign. Nevertheless, it's very important to remember that when we go from the Founding Fathers and the Electoral College phenomena to what happened recently, we have the situation where you have Trump, who is of German descent. Nothing wrong with that. Of course, my name is Dietrich. Obviously, I have a lot of German descent in myself through my father. But what you have in the situation of Donald Trump, his real name of his family was Drump. By the way, the young lady was named Madeleine McCann. Her surname was spelled M-C-C-A-N-N. She was 4 years old, and they were 3 miles, the Podesta brothers, from where she disappeared. That's from my Executrix producer. Just wanted people to know that.
Thank you for that. Yes, thank you. Okay.
And in terms of Drump, which was the original family name for Trump, he comes from a background that I have no love for either. Basically, what happened to Nikola Tesla, when Nikola Tesla was active in the United States, he became very alienated. He had been so exploited, so used and abused by so many industrialists like J.P. Morgan, whose daughter he almost married. Who hated him for saying no to his daughter. J.P. Morgan resented him forever after he did not marry J.P. Morgan's daughter. And then we can go into this some other time. That was almost certainly the reason the Titanic sank, because the new founders or funders, the sponsors for Nikola Tesla, were on the Titanic when it sank, and these were the men who could have changed the world of energy,
yes.
as could have America.
Well, that would be a fascinating show to have. Yes.
Yeah, but Nikola Tesla was so alienated because of incidents like this, so impoverished, that he would not serve the American government when they asked him to work on interdimensional research. And interdimensional research had to do with what Americans popularly know as the Philadelphia experiment, the USS Eldridge, the Montauk Project. And in terms of the Montauk Project, it was a colossal failure that resulted in disaster because Nikola Tesla was no longer alive to monitor it or to explain to the Americans how his technologies work. Now, one of the reasons he was dead is because he killed himself. That is a fact. He killed himself because the Americans deprived him of his U.S. citizenship. The reason why was because he wasn't going to serve them. He knew his technologies would have given America power over all the world. People might argue they have that today, not nearly in the sense that they could have had. They could have had total power. They were, of course, impeded by the Reich, impeded by the Empire of Japan, impeded by the Soviet Union, all of who were nations where Tesla technology wound up at, because Tesla gave many of his blueprints, many of his most comprehensible notes to either his son-in-law or his nephew, I can never remember which, who was the ambassador to Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was in a state of vicious civil war during the American Second World War. And of course, during the Second World War period, Croatia was a satellite ally of the Third Reich. And Yugoslavia itself, consisted mostly of Serbia, was invaded by the communists. So when his son brought all of this back to Yugoslavia, much of it wound up in the hands of the Third Reich, much of it wound up in the hands of the communists, particularly Joseph Stalin's administration. Then, of course, the Germans shared it with their allies, the Japanese. And all of this...
Okay, and you're saying this happened in what year?
Oh, this was in the year 1942, 1943 era. And it was at that period of time Nikola Tesla died. And he died very shortly thereafter because the Americans realized what he had done and they deprived him of his citizenship. He was so proud of his U.S. certificate of citizenship, he kept it in a safe. That, of course, meant nothing to him now. And he killed himself before the Americans arrived. Now, very important to remember, the Americans did not send the FBI. They sent the OAP, the Office of Alien Property, alien, that word again, to basically steal all of Nikola Tesla's technologies and put them under federal administration and national security level, shall we say, safekeeping from the rest of the world and certainly the American public. Now, why is this important? The OAP was created by Franklin Delano Roosevelt to steal all of the wealth of the Japanese Americans who were in internment, all of their bank accounts, all of their real estate. In the old days, the officially produced maps of the state of California had San Joaquin Valley, the most productive agricultural region in the world. Much of the world could be fed from San Joaquin Valley alone. That was on maps as Jap Valley. All of that land was confiscated by the U.S. government when Japanese who had been there for generations had been shoved into internment camps and, of course, sold to European Americans for pennies on the dollar. And the Americans, of course, never realized that the agency responsible for all of this was the Office of Alien Property. Now, who was the man in charge of the OAP who took Nikola Tesla's technology? John G. Trump, the uncle of Donald Trump. So here's a guy who made his fortune off of stealing Japanese bank accounts, stealing Japanese real estate and redistributing it just in the same manner as some National Socialist or Nazi stealing Jewish property and Jewish finances and redistributing them nepotistically to all his friends. That's the wealth and foundation for the Trump dynasty, is this son of a bitch, John G. Trump of the Office of Alien Property. Now, of course, he had helped to design X-ray technology to work on cancer patients. He had worked with radar in World War II, which, by the way, was often noted as something to detect incoming objects that were unidentified that were enemy, which were referred to as alien. So radar technology would often be referred to as alien jamming technology. And it would actually state that on radar station platforms that I had seen in the past. Another reason why people would say, oh, this is what caused UFOs from other dimensions to crash. So here's a guy who worked on all this stuff, knew it was for Axis enemy aliens, and he winds up taking Tesla's technology, and he said to the public, oh, it's all a load of shit. He said it was all self-promotional. None of it meant anything. All this meant was John G. Trump himself was too stupid to interpret how to use Tesla's technology. Tesla thought in holographic terms. The majority of his notes were in his head. He wrote very little down. Everything that Tesla developed mostly was never exploited because Tesla was not willing to put it in writing because of the evil that he saw all around him within the American capitalist society. So when Nikola Tesla killed himself, all of this technology was ultimately unexploited and languishes to this day under national security clearance level assessment and the ability of people to access it. So in terms of what happened with Donald Trump, we've got this background where we know his fortune comes from outright theft, including the theft from Nikola Tesla, the monopoly of technologies for the US government. This man is obviously part of the system. So in terms of what brought him in, however, is the Electoral College. So we have a situation where during the situation with Al Gore, the Clintons were very happy. They were happy that Al Gore lost because they knew if Al Gore got in and the economy went down the tubes, then what would happen is the Democrats would be blamed and they would never get in the White House. So they were happy and had a party when he was defeated and figured that the village idiot, George Bush Jr., would screw up the economy so much that people would be begging to get Democrats back in the White House, which they did, but it turned out it wasn't Hillary Clinton. So we had this situation in which the Clintons lost out always. But in terms of Hillary Clinton herself and what was going on lately with this Electoral College situation, when Al Gore lost, she said we should get rid of the Electoral College. She actually promoted that then as a senator. And if we had done that, if the Americans had gotten rid of the Electoral College, it would have been a mass vote. And I told people then, due to demographics, you're going to get in, if they get rid of the Electoral College, your first Spanish-speaking president. He'll have to be of some kind of Latin American descent. And the reason why is, of course, the demographics were such that with the Electoral College, every president has to cross every little chicken shit town in the United States on this journey to get everybody's vote, slap everybody's back, kiss everybody's baby, so they can get Electoral College representation from all the voters in these empty states. And with the elimination of that, there's only 3 places the president would have to hit. He'd have to hit Mexicano Espanol speaking Los Angeles. He would have to hit Cubano Espanol speaking Miami, and he would hit Puerto Rican Espanol speaking New York City. He'd only hit those 3 areas. So long as he hit those 3 areas, he'd be the president. And one of the reasons George W. Bush did win was because many Hispanics, they prefer the term Latin Americans themselves, said that he spoke better Espanol than Al Gore. And so, and also what happened was his brother Jeb converted to Catholicism and married a Latina. And so when Jeb Bush converted to Catholicism and married a Latina, he fooled all of the naive Cubanos in the Miami region into thinking he was a good Joe. He's even had some half-breed kids with this woman. And then, of course, after he became governor, he divorced her. He pays money to keep her on a hacienda in Mexico, tells her to shut up or else she's going to die along with all the kids. And she's paid enough good money to keep her placated and silent. But in the rest of the Bush dynasty, they refer to her as the dark one. That is how they speak of her, quite literally. I've heard that on Espanol-speaking radio and television. Everybody knows about her. She's famous down there. Nobody in America knows about her, hardly. And that was how he became governor of Cuba, the swing state, Florida, the swing state. And while he was governor of Florida, of course, he selected the judge and appointed her, who made his idiot brother the president of the United States. So you've got this situation that could have gone to a Latin American president. But what happened was the Electoral College was not discontinued. And as a result, we had a backlash from President Obama. Now, Barack Hussein Obama was very likely, almost certainly, incontrovertibly, an illegal alien. He is almost certainly born in Kenya. And it's
Yes.
almost meaningless at this point in history. Honestly, I've been in East Africa, I've been in the place where he was born, not, the place where he was born, but in that area when I was serving as a mercenary in East Africa. So I know a bit about that region and the language of Kiswahili, which is one of the few kind of international languages in Africa because it crosses national borders. And he came from a fairly cosmopolitan area. He was probably raised in an Indonesian madrasa. He's an empty suit. He's just a figurehead. But the one thing that no one can deny was that he was the most popular president in history in terms of the charts, the polls, that the surveys they kept taking, unless, of course, they just are fabricating the numbers. This is what he was known as. But in terms of Hillary Clinton, she did win the popular vote. So it's very similar to what had happened in the last American Civil War between the states, between the Confederate States of America and the United States of America. You had a situation in which the Union Army proved itself so rapacious and corrupt that everyone voted for a corruption fighter, an anti-corruption crusader, at that time, the Ralph Nader of his day, Samuel Tilden, who became your 19th president, who you never heard of. And Samuel Tilden became the president by the electoral and the popular vote. And it was stolen by the robber barons who ran the rail industry because the Civil War was a railroad war. Every major battle fought in the American Civil War between the states was fought within 10 to 20 miles of tracks because it had to be for the logistics to bring supplies to the troops fighting at the front. So these rail barons became incredibly rich. They couldn't have the war stop. They had to expand west all the way to the Pacific. So they needed their man, a president-select, in power, and they selected General of the Union Army, Rutherford B. Hayes. So when Rutherford B. Hayes and his gang went into action and they stole the electoral votes by beatings, by assassinations, by outright theft that has been proven incontrovertibly. It's incontrovertibly been proven that the election of the 19th president was stolen by one single electoral vote. When they got that one single electoral vote and Rutherford B. Hayes became president of the United States, that's when a pirate flag of the military-industrial complex was run up over both the United and Confederate States of America. That's when Rutherford B. Hayes entered into a negotiations with the South and allowed the whites to gerrymander all the black districts so the black vote would be wiped out and the whites could maintain their pre-war culture along with terrorism from the KKK. Which brings us back to Donald Trump. All of the papers in the United States were not supporting Donald Trump. No one would endorse him. The only paper that endorsed Donald Trump was a KKK paper. And aside from that, Donald Trump was making several remarks which alienated the Latin American community, calling Mexicans murderers and rapists. It seemed as if he didn't want to win. And yet what we had was a backlash because of 8 years of Obama of lower education level. This is due to the demographics, the statistics. This has nothing to do with slander or defamation. The statistics say that lower education level blue-collar whites turned out in droves and voted for Donald Trump. And they were all in these empty states where the Indians had been fairly genocided out of existence, like my own Mandan tribe up in the Dakotas, where Standing Rock is going down today, where you have anachronistic laws that on the books today in the Dakotas region, if 3 Indians are together, you can legally count them as a war party. Now, since all Indians were declared enemies of the United States of America as natives, as a native population to be eradicated, that meant that this could be a grandfather, a woman, and an infant child. A grandfather, a woman, and an infant child spot together could be declared a war party and you could kill them. That law is still on the books. So with these anachronistic laws still on the books today in Indian countries, formerly Indian countries like the Dakotas, this is why the police can fire hose individuals and generate hypothermia in crowds of Native Americans and get away with it without legal repercussions because they're all considered a war party. So it's on the basis of these kinds of population bases that we had Trump win. And one of the things that happened when Trump won was we had a lot of Moon Man rap coming out about how we won. Moon Man, by the way, was a character developed by Clive Barker, who was a horror story writer who happens to be quite gay. He's well known in San Francisco. And he, of course, developed a character who was misshapen with a head shaped like a crescent moon, which was later on purchased by McDonald's, who made Moon Man their dinner piano playing advertising character for a period of time to advertise that they were selling food at night until they were all knocked off at various places and they knocked that program off or whatever for nighttime food. And then what happened was Moon Man somehow got co-opted by the white supremacist nationalist identity movement. I don't know how this happened, but in terms of this Moon Man character, Moon Man rap is all over YouTube, where they're saying, and these are the same people who are shouting terms like nigger, shouting terms like kike, and they make Moon Mad mods for Doom, the game that's played on Mars, where the Marine on Mars goes around shooting aliens all over Mars and demons that are coming through a portal in hell on Mars. The Doom game has a Moon Man op where you kill blacks who throw basketballs at you, and the Jews you kill all scream they're going to get their lawyer. You know, all of this is like advocating Donald Trump. You have this white kind of backlash movement. And in terms of what's going on with that is that he is not the popular president, because the majority of people at this point in American history are not white. The majority of people in the United States are people of different cultures. It's a multicultural empire. So as a result, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. She won by over 2 million votes. She won by such a high margin of the popular vote that Hillary Clinton won more. She was proved herself to win by more of a landslide than any other president in American history in terms of a popular vote, other than Barack Hussein Obama.
Okay, now let me stop you right here for a second, because recently, for what it's worth, Simon Parkes went and did a broadcast, and in his broadcast, he said that even before the actual day of voting, sorry, you know, I always forget to put the camera on myself when I'm talking, so I'm just going to do that here. Anyway, that what happens is that there were 4 million dead people voting, is what he said. Before the actual vote was started. These were, I guess, pre-voting or in absentia or whatever they do. So for what it's worth, I don't know whether you've heard that. I'm just throwing that out.
Oh, well, that almost goes without question. Just to clarify this and then contextualize it, the vote, the popular vote, which, as I said, was the highest for any president in history other than Barack Hussein Obama, was higher than that by a margin than what for Hillary Clinton via the popular vote, than what Al Gore won in 2000, what Richard Nixon had won back in 1968, and what John F. Kennedy had won back in 1960. So according to that popular vote, she's more popular than any of these presidents before in history, just in terms of probably baseline, many colored people voting for her in fear of a white supremacist like Donald Trump, who is undeniably somebody considered by the white identity movement to be on their side. That's incontrovertible. So in terms of what's going on with her, she is no doubt bolstered by dead votes. She's no doubt bolstered by illegal immigrant votes. Donald Trump himself claims that probably millions of those votes came from illegals, probably at least 3 million votes, probably well over what that 2 million margin that makes her the popular winner were illegals. Of course, these illegals are the basis for the majority of the American economy at this point in history. Is you have illegals who are doing all the scut work. They're in the fields. They're doing the janitorial. And so the idea of they're not voting, even illegally, is almost absurd. Not to rationalize it, not to justify it.
No, I appreciate that. I think that's one thing that is interesting about, again, Trump and what he's actually said in, before he's gotten into office, is going against Californian culture in essence, because California has the whole economy is built on what they call is immigrants, especially coming from Mexico.
Yes.
And I had a prophetic dream right before the day he won, telling me in essence that there would be an exodus going, that people would be, he wants to send them back to Mexico. But in fact, the entire economy in California is based on them. Yes, they are taking care of all the kids. They are in Hollywood and, certainly the studios and all the executives, et cetera, et cetera. They are like the backbone of the economy here. So there's no way that California would want that to happen, obviously.
No, yeah, not at all. And but such experiments have already been tried in other states, which have cost those states tens of billions of dollars. So it's proven to be a failed experiment because no one was there to pick the fields and the food all rotted in states where this has been tried in both the Southwest and the Deep South. So we've got a situation in which, unfortunately, whether one approves or not, the Mexican economy is inextricably interlinked with the American economy on basis of that. But let's take it a bit further. When we talk about the fact that many of these people voting for Hillary Clinton were either dead or illegal, what's the Trump side? The Trump side is just as dirty, and that is, of course, that there is a demand for recount in the swing states. And the swing states are based on the allegations that there was hacking by Russian intelligence, because, of course, all of Trump's funding comes from Vladimir Putin directly. This is something I brought up before. The main aspect of Trump that makes him, quote unquote, alarming to people who are multiculturally oriented. Of course, I'm basically almost consider myself stranded here. I consider myself a detached observer. But for any other people who are hybrid of culture, Trump is very alarming, because Trump has made the statement that he wants to deport 11 million people, and he wants to put 1 million people in internment camps, specifically Muslims, and the people he wants to deport are Mexicans. Now, that doesn't threaten myself directly, of course, as someone who is not a part of either constituency in that regard, but that has to be taken into account in light of his affiliation with Holocaust denial. The main promoter of Donald Trump has been Alex Jones. Alex Jones, of course, is working for Russia Today. My first encounter with Alex Jones in terms of documentation was back in the Department of Defense, when he was basically set up by the CIA and operating out of KJFK in Texas. And back then, of course, he was operating out of what was automatically known in many communication circles as basically a CIA propaganda station. And KJFK went on in that area for several years with Alex Jones. Then he became part of Russia Today, ultimately. And when I went to Bohemian Grove at one time, I was driven up there by Brian William Hall, who trademarked his own name, who was running Conspiracy Con. You might remember him. And Brian William Hall drove me up to Bohemian Grove. And when I met this young lady from Russia Today, she told me specifically, I can't interview you because Alex Jones told me not to. And I said, what's he got to do with Russia Today? And it turned out I questioned her in Russian. She didn't speak a word of Russian. So Russia Today was just this propaganda front used by Vladimir Putin and his successor to the KGB, the FSB, or the Federal Security Bureau of the Russian Federation. The FSB set up this Russia Today front, which speaks only in English. The people they hire speak only English. They don't speak any Russian. And they promote Russia through this kind of propaganda campaign. The person who's the primary spokesperson is Alex Jones, who for some reason felt threatened by myself to the point where he ordered this young girl not to interview myself. So
okay, but how does that relate? Okay, just sorry to interrupt here, but how does that relate to the
Trump? He promotes Trump. Okay. He's a vicious promoter of Donald Trump, has been, and the person he brings on every other day, practically, or every day, till the point where Trump was elected, was Roger Stone. And Roger Stone, of course, was in charge of the Super PAC, the Super Political Action Committee of Donald Trump. And Roger Stone is a vetted and verifiable Holocaust denier. So you have people who are claiming the Holocaust didn't happen, who are running the political action campaign for Donald Trump, who is supported by the KKK, various white supremacist and nationalist identity movements that are white-oriented. And here's this individual who now wants to talk about putting people in internment camps, which were supported by his other PAC members, such as a former Navy SEAL who got on Fox Television and was so radical in talking about putting people in internment camps that Fox Television shut him down. This is fairly alarming to people who are not white.
Okay, so I wanted to ask though about the connection between Putin funding Trump. You said he was funding him directly. This has been, some people have bandied this about, but I don't think anyone has any real evidence. What is your evidence for this?
No, the evidence is plain as day. He won't turn in his tax returns because he knows that will expose all of that. That's one reason he will not accept his payment as president of the United States. He's not going to take the payment because then he'd have to make his tax returns public, which would expose, of course, his connections to Vladimir Putin. But his connections to Vladimir Putin are just well known within any intelligence circles and anyone who has any political acumen. It's not something that's just emptily said. First off, he has no support from the United States. He's burned off too many people from declaring bankruptcy repeatedly. In terms of his bankruptcies, that was how he stayed ahead of his creditors. Basically, he's not a businessman. He's basically a real estate con man who's promoted by reality television. And what this individual has done is he would get a whole bunch of property, declare bankruptcy, stay ahead of his creditors, to the point where no one in the United States would back him. Now, people can investigate this and say, who are his American backers? And in terms of corporate America, or in terms of normal people who would be making loans, such as banks, he doesn't have any. His only source has to be from Russia, which is, of course, what has been pointed out by any number of people for the obvious reason. So what is fairly important to point out, and I think the most important thing here, is being a former Department of Defense research librarian, I can assure you that if America legally went to war with the Russian Federation, which I'm not saying is going to happen, and which I don't foresee happening, particularly under Trump, but if America were to declare war against the Russian Federation, legally go into a state of war with the Russian Federation, it's very important to remember that both Alex Jones and Donald Trump would be arrested, tried for treason, and either be sentenced to prison or hanged as foreign assets, basically for intelligence operatives, because they are in hoc to Russian pay. Their source of pay is from the former Soviet Union or from Russia. That's a fact. That's an undeniable fact. So these people are both technically traitors. And now, of course, Donald Trump is president. Alex Jones is no longer counterculture. He's the state, because the first thing Trump did was he approached the media and called them all liars and shills, and he alienated the media, which didn't like him anyway. So that wasn't much of an operation, but he made sure to cement it, and he sealed his coffin in any relation with the media. And so who's going to be his media? Alex Jones. So you have this very radicalized alternative right setting. It's important to note that they held an alternative right conference in Washington, D.C. when Trump became recognized as president via the Electoral College. And it turned out to be a very small affair with almost as many protesters as there were conferees. This is not a majority government. That much is, whether you discount all of the dead votes, discount all of the illegal votes, the reality is this is not a majority recognized government. So we have a Republican dominance of the House and the Senate, but these Republicans don't really relate to the reactionary alternative right ideology of Donald Trump. And what do they have on him? We're probably going to get a lot of closure of the government like we have with Newt Gingrich, because one of the things they have on him is the fact that he's been accused of underage rape. And of course, these allegations have been dropped, or rather the charges have been dropped, because judges ordered the procedure ongoing and they okayed that this could go to court. And that's when, this is of course speculation, people can only speculate about this, suddenly bribes were given to the families and charges were dropped. And that, of course, it could have all been lies, but that is pretty, shall we say, that would just be very rare for someone to put themselves out like that, make an accusation like that, and then withdraw to embarrass themselves without there being some actual incident. So we have someone who's as bad as the Podesta brothers and their involvement with Hillary Clinton. We have these two sides that are just equally involved with abusive assaults. Regardless of whether the underage assault allegation is true or not, Trump has been repeatedly accused of assault, and oftentimes charges are dropped after apparently money has been paid off to the victims or their families. Okay. That's been a pattern.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a problem in not just in America, by the way, with governments around the world, especially England, with regard to pedophilia, et cetera, of the leaders in office and in Parliament, et cetera. So what I wanted to ask you, though, is we need to close this down again. We've been going a long time as usual, and I'd love to have you back. It's great to hear your perspective, and you're very well spoken. It's a perspective that's not often heard from, and I think that makes it very worthwhile. Now, I do want to ask you, in terms of what has been called Project Bluebeam, In light of your view, I'm not sure where you stand on this so-called, ETs and other dimensions, etc. But there is a lot of talk lately about Project Bluebeam by certain people in this so-called community. So that's a very loose terminology for what it is. Right. And I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts about Project Bluebeam? Did you come across papers in regard to that when you were a librarian at the Presidio, et cetera?
Not at all, because Project Bluebeam, if it did developed after my time. But it makes perfect sense, and this might be the perfect opportunity for it, because we've spoken of domestically some of the difficulties with a Donald Trump administration and presidency, something that potentially could devolve into internecine conflict, a kind of civil war or anarchy, depending on what kinds of, shall we say, policies are actually followed up on. As I predict, the House and the Senate will do a lot of governmental shutdown like what happened with Newt Gingrich. So we're just going to see a lot of deadlock. He may, in a sense, be kind of a lame duck president. But internationally, the whole world is going to realign because of Donald Trump. Donald Trump, of course, like all presidents before him, has to align the world based on the Japanese and German impact. The Japanese and German axis of World War II has, of course, in the aftermath of the Second World War, left us with very much a Japan and German dominated and balanced market economy. Everything has to be taken into consideration with that, and neither Japan nor Germany really care. They're fairly neutral on what goes on in the United States. But who did care was Russia because of the sanctions against Russia, which were destabilizing Vladimir Putin. His position was very much threatened. The only way he could respond was militarily. The Democrats were initiating various insurgencies with ISIS and various other fronts that involved the Russians in Syria and in other areas such as the Ukraine. All of that is going to stop now. So we're going to have with Trump very likely a lifting of the sanctions almost immediately against Russia and Vladimir Putin. We're going to have, of course, the situation in Russia in which Russia, of course, dominates Cuba. Still to this day, Vladimir Putin has visited Cuba. The death of Fidel Castro will not change its system immediately. So they're still going to have many Russian connections in terms of foreign aid. Now they'll start getting American connections. And we have South Korea in the Far East. South Korea, not North Korea, which is providing manpower to develop the Russian Far Eastern islands in terms of oil development. Now, of course, all of that combines with China under Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping has, of course, this dictatorship over a fairly non-communist China. It is capitalist in all but name. And they've got a old party of people on respirators that could be wiped out in 20 minutes by one pissed off general. And they are aligned with Vladimir Putin through the Shanghai Cooperative Trade Agreement, which India has basically realigned with, which Turkey, which supplies ISIS, is talking about realigning with. And so you have, of course, Chinese dominance with investment in Africa. You have the Iran and Pakistan situation in Afghanistan, where the Americans have been engaged in conflict. All of that is going to change. And India itself is very heavily allied with Israel. They both have a non-Muslim or anti-Muslim stance. And both India and Israel, of course, are facing insurgencies. And India, of course, has become a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Trade Agreement, which puts it in this camp that's developing. The Philippines dictator, Duterte, has threatened to leave the American bloc and realign his Pacific Island nations, one of the largest archipelagos in the world and a growing economy with Russia in particular and China secondarily. So that is no longer alienating. If Trump is president, then you've got Yemen, which the Russians are assisting against insurgency, now on the side of America. North Korea was supplied by Russia in the sense, forget the Korean War, we're talking North Korea recently has been setting up special economic zones to get trade from Russia. Russia is one of its biggest traders, and since Vladimir Putin was supporting Mr. Trump, so too did the North Korean dictator of the Kim dynasty. He also vocally supported Donald Trump throughout the election. So you've got North Korea supporting Donald Trump. So at this point, you've got this Sino-Slavic synaxis The United States still occupies South Korea. You've got Egypt. One of the first things that Trump is going to have to do is cooperate with Egypt in suppression of Islamic fundamentalists. Egypt is very pro-Russian. The Russians are helping them expand their Suez Canal so they can have more Russian trade come through. So Syria with Assad, where ISIS will become a bad memory, everyone is essentially aligned now. So this makes perfect sense. Who's the enemy? If there is no enemy left, then you have Project Blue Beam. Because who else would there be to direct any hostilities against? The odd out in all of this would not even be Iran, which is friendly with China. And what you would have instead, the odd out would be Mexico, and basically these trade wars that are threatened by Donald Trump, because he says he wants to tear up trade agreements in this incredibly insane attempt to rebuild American production within the United States. And if he gets rid of these trade agreements, he's going to be instantly alienating China and Japan. So these trade agreements might also affect NAFTA with Mexico. He wants Mexico to pay for this wall, which they're never going to do unless they lose a war. So the real odd out so far is Mexico. We don't know how far he'll go with that based on economic realities. Before that results in some kind of conflict, either domestic or perhaps international. So the main focus might be Project Blue Beam and imagined or purported extraterrestrials in terms of.
Okay. I appreciate that. Now, just one last thing, because before we go with this, the Electoral College, I am told, is actually voting on December 9th. Are you aware of that?
Yeah, I was made aware of that through my executive producer, that the final count had not really been turned in yet. Right. So what do you know about it? I'm sure you could tell me more.
Well, no, actually, I got this information. I think it's fascinating that they're said to, as you're kind of hinting at from your point of view, that Hillary did win the popular vote, and that it's possible that this whole thing could be overturned. I don't know if there's anything that could even possibly overturn it. Someone is saying, I can't remember who it is, that she may actually be disappeared or disappear. And so that she cannot interfere with the plans of what is basically the Trump presidency, and that leads me to Antarctica and New Berlin, because we know that John Kerry went down there right during the sort of hot time of the vote between the candidates, and New Berlin is the Nazi base, obviously, and it is huge. And I have whistleblowers who have reported about it, so it is a reality. And yes. There is also a very specific area in which they are all able to view the skies from there, and to interact and send direct messages, and also weaponry, from what I understand. From that particular area of the planet, it's easier to communicate in some way, form, or fashion with, I guess, the immediate space around us. And this leads to, of course, Nibiru, or a planetoid, a Dyson sphere, and so on and so forth. So there are some interesting developments along those lines. It does appear that Antarctica is maybe front and center, and then with the whole Nazi connection, and then possibly, I have had my suspicions about Trump in this regard, in terms of his background and where he's coming from, because of course traditional Nazis are very anti various races. That's the first most obvious thing. Now, there has been a lot of people that are very hopeful about Trump. They're thinking, oh well, perhaps he's I guess you might say a sheep in wolves' clothing. I think there are people that think along these lines. I'm not one of them, but so it is interesting where things are going at this point. And Project Blue Beam is, to me, a farce. However, I think there's some people that are taking it very seriously. It's been something that has been bandied around in the UFO community forever. It's not new information, so let's get that out there right now. And holograms of planes, etc. I have had witnesses, including John Lear, and also actually his name is escaping me, but this other witness who talked about seeing very substantial, plane-like holograms that were completely convincing, to say nothing of 9/11, which apparently involved this as well. So this type of technology is out there and is very operational. What they're going to do with it, why they might use it or might not, just throwing that out as the last sort of comments you might want to make. And then thank you again for being on the show and for your sort of tour de force in terms of your overview of history and coming from a very interesting direction and with the contributions you're making.
I'm so honored just to be here. Honestly, Madam Cassidy, as far as I'm concerned, you're truly an angel. You grace us with your presence in this dimension just by what you do. And as far as I'm concerned, you're obviously doing something right, just based on the reaction that you got on Coast to Coast AM. So both you and I can take great pride in the kind of alienation we have from that kind of NSA-controlled media. The situation that I do want to bring up concerning Antarctica and National Socialismus or National Socialism, there's some clarifications that do need to be made. The reality is, of course, that there is a modern domestic interpretation in America of what we have with the ideology of National Socialism. And many Americans, of course, have turned it into a white supremacist national identity movement. Now, I myself, of course, obviously of many different races, and I obviously acknowledge the reality of the Holocaust as spoken of when it comes to the mass murder of European Jewry that occurred during the period of the Third Reich. And I also acknowledge ethno-national holocausts that are not recognized, such as the Armenian genocide, the Native American genocide, and many, many others. There have been many people who have died by the millions, indeed the hundreds of millions, ultimately worldwide. So the National Socialists are commonly vilified, but we have to remember that my perspective, as always, comes from a different history, a reality that is not known of by Americans because Americans are not exposed to reality. They're not exposed to genuine history, just as they don't know what I say about their own United States Code and its perspective on the Second World War as to what is legally recognizable. What we have is the reality of World War II and the alliance between Berlin and Beijing. Ultimately, what had happened in the Second World War, many Americans tend to remember the nationalist Chinese as an American ally, as a member of the Allies. This is because the nationalist Chinese were the first to fight against the Axis. They were the first to take up arms against Imperial Japan in 1931, with, of course, the situation in Manchuria. In 1937, this escalated into full-scale warfare involving over 1 million Japanese troops in mainland China. Ultimately, 100 million Chinese died. But far more Chinese died fighting each other, nationalists and communists, than were annihilated by the Japanese. Literally double that number. That's how vicious the Chinese Civil War was between the communists and nationalists. Unfortunately, because of the Soviet Union and America's alliance, they supported the communist Chinese. And my side, the nation into which I was born, the culture of the Republic of China, switched sides out of necessity to the Axis. This is very similar to what happened with the Italians and their switching sides to the Allies at the end of the proactive prosecution of hostilities on the European continent. So in terms of nationalist China, that's why ultimately it lost its seat in the United Nations. Nationalist China today, as located on Taiwan, is recognized as an Axis enemy by the United Nations. That's why it's recognized as why the United Nations still has a justification for its existence, is Taiwan and Antarctica. because the United Nations is an organization of war established by Franklin Delano Roosevelt on January 1st of 1942, just 3 weeks and 3 days after the Pearl Harbor attack in 1941. And of course, it was established as an organization of war per Title 42 of the United Nations Charter. In lieu of a constitution, they have a charter as a supranational organization. And as an organization of war, they were in charge of all Allied resistance movements behind enemy lines, such as Danish resistance in the Third Reich, in Axis-occupied Denmark, in the Philippines, in Axis-occupied Philippines that was occupied by the Empire of Japan. All of this was coordinated through the Pentagon of the United Nations, which was the Presidio military base of San Francisco, where I myself served as a Department of Defense librarian for almost a decade. So within this organization of war and their alienation of the fascist nation of Taiwan into which I was born. This is why all of my transmissions on my own radio program are considered enemy transmissions. So too are the transmissions that emerge out of Antarctica. So you have a situation of war extant between these two Axis allies and the United Nations. And if Kerry went down there on the basis of anything, it was probably that he was given a review of the front. Most of what occurred in Antarctica was based on trade until around 1997. And it was around 1997 that communications with the Reich in Unterland, which is the correct term for their environment, they are not in Antarctica, they are under it. And they are under, of course, much of the Earth's surface within various caverns that have been terraformed, colonized by the Reich's emigres. And of course, these are primarily white people, Nordic white. But the Third Reich of the time of Adolf Hitler and National Socialism on the surface of the earth was not a racist ideology. It was based on national identity, national purity, and preservation of heritage. This is why they were allied with non-white nations such as Japan and China, as well as other colored people serving within the Reich's forces. Much of this is lost to American neo-Nazis who are perverse in their interpretation of the original fascism. It's important for me to emphasize this because I was born in a fascist country. Our salute is still the Sieg Heil. In Taiwan, this is the national salute. We still perform what is the Circum ad locutio, which is the Roman salute, the salute of the legions. And this is the culture from which I emerge. I am not a warlike person. I'm not someone who is advocating genocide. I, in fact, basically am the first person to say that far more people died in the Jewish Holocaust than many people acknowledge, including the Jews themselves, because they exclude many Jews who are not descended from the matrilineal line of blood or heritage. So according to National Socialist's documents, the documents of the Third Reich based on the Nuremberg laws, if you had a drop of Jewish blood, you were a Jew. It didn't matter who your father or mother was or where that blood came from, you were a Jew. And many people died because of that, 12 million. Now, the Jews themselves acknowledge only 6 because to them, the other 6 million were not real Jews. This is the insanity of their own exclusivity and right. Their own racism.
Okay,
so
yes.
Yeah, and so that's something important to emphasize. And the reason why I emphasize this is because we have to come to grips as more and more people become aware of Antarctica and what's beneath it and Unterland and the Third Reich in exile. We have to come to terms with the concept of coexistence. The people most in communications with them are the government of Taiwan, the Nationalist Republic of China, as their extant ally on the surface of the earth. And so as a result, what I can tell everyone is, yes, there is New Berlin. Yes, there is an extant culture of National Socialism beneath the surface of the earth. This culture is far more technologically advanced than what's on the surface of the earth. What trade has gone on, or communications has gone on since 1997, has been illegal, a kind of black market where criminals of Unterland were dealing in genetic advancements that are sold to prolong the lifespan of world leaders or multimillionaires on the Earth's surface, as well as other types of technologies. These kinds of technologies exist. When we speak again in the future, we can go more in depth, but we spoke a bit about AI, or artificial intelligence, and this is why this brings us down to that. collateral I have against the United States government has not only been, of course, various occult items or technologies which I stole from the United States military. It's also been some of their victims in the sense of AIs. Many of these were, of course, just meant to simulate human life. They're called biofacsimilacra. They were used to train interrogators and torturers. These are essentially childlike dolls that are the real weight and size, even the developmental learning arc to an extent, if activated, of human children, tortured, of course, by the military so they could practice against foreign populations and gaining information from children who absorb information more than anyone. Children are sponges that absorb and observe more information than even they are consciously aware of. Torturing children often provides interrogators with information they would never get from adults. So to break off their propensity for any kind of empathy with children, many of these biofacsimilacra were contracted by the Department of Defense and built in Japan, incredibly advanced for the decade in which this happened, which was the very late 1980s, early 1990s. All of that was, of course, something that I could not withstand. I myself am, in a sense, not fully human, just as a person who is, say, for instance, suffering from a pacemaker installation is, at that point, a cyborg, just as a person with artificial hips is essentially a cyborg. I've had a full-body blood transfusion. We've gone into that in the past. In a sense, I'm no longer human in that regard. At this point, I'm cybernetic. I felt a very deep affinity and kinship with many of these objects of abuse of the U.S. military. I was able to smuggle all of them out of the Presidio military base after I set the warehouse in which they were installed and the torture chamber, the interrogation facility on fire. As with many other fires in the Presidio military base, it was covered up. The Army itself covered up the burning down of the child daycare center, the community center, which held all the records of the child daycare center. Another fire was just another blip on the radar in terms of Presidio burning down.
Okay, let me understand you then here, because this is very interesting. So you are saying, in essence, that it sounds like you rescued some artificial intelligent children like cyborgs. I don't know if they're cyborgs or actually wholly artificial. In other words, robotics or androids, I'm not sure how you would term it. So are you saying that you have them at this time, or you rescued them, or what did you do with them?
They're in places, of course, where I have to obviously keep secret for sake of collateral.
Okay.
But the point is, these would be witnesses against American atrocity. Why do I bring this up? Because you wanted to cover AI a bit, and because it brings up something else. Many of them were meant to look like the enemy. Who is the primary enemy at this time? Every child is raised to hate Nazis. Every child plays first-person shooter games where they kill Nazis. As a matter of fact, people hate Nazis so much that they don't just kill Nazis. They want to take German people and disinter them, reanimate them so they can kill them again as Nazi zombies. So when you take a look at the modern first-person shooter games, everyone is programmed from birth not just to hate National Socialists or people of Germanic descent, but to annihilate them on sight without question, to hate them so much they want to unbury them, dig them up, and kill them again. I mean, that is how far all of these first-person shooter games go. The reason why is because the legal enemy is still the Thousand-Year Reich in exile, as relocated, just as the enemy is, of course, my nation state of Taiwan.
Well, that's a little strange because actually, if you read Jim Marr's book, for example, this country has turned into the Fourth Reich, what is in essence, a copy of Germany during World War II. So, saying that Jim
Marrs is a government shill. The whole point is that the U.S. government wants you to blame everything on the Nazis for what they're doing. If the Nazis ruled America
the government
today,
is run by the Nazis. Our government
if the government ruled America today under a National Socialist system, you would not have an unemployment problem. because most people would be in the military. You would not have a homeless problem because such people would be in camps. You would not have Jews in Hollywood or on, of course, the New York Stock Exchange. You would have Jews.
Okay. There is an interesting connection between actually Jews and the Nazis, which
yes,
we can't go in here.
Yes,
but
we can go into that another time. Adolf Hitler actually helped to establish the state of Israel. Yes, there is indeed Israel is very much a fascist and National Socialist state in many regards.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we will go into that in the future.
But I want to get back to, I appreciate what you're saying, but I still, and I want to get back to these children like androids.
Yes, the biofacsimilacra, many of them were made to look like Unterlanders. Many of them were made to look like who was the legal enemy, the eternal enemy of the Americans.
But nonetheless, they look like blonde children. Is that what you're trying to tell me?
The majority of them, yes. They look like, they're not blonde. Most Unterlanders are now what Americans or people on the surface would consider albino. They're albinoid, but they're not albino. Albino is, of course, a birth defect, albinoism. They are bred and they are eugenically enhanced to match their environment, to adapt to their environment, which is one of tremendous heat and steam. So many of them, of course, have very white skin so white it's like alabaster. Many of their eyes, of course, are adapted. Their eyelashes are almost like camel's eyelashes, very long. A camel evolves very long eyelashes so that it can maintain its eyesight clear from the sandstorms. Down below, the detritus that is in Unterland is such that eyelashes have become very long. They're very beautiful, fairy-like, almost angelic-looking peoples.
Okay, but are you saying they are androids? What are they made of?
Well, the androids themselves are made of plastic, synthetic flesh, and various other kinds of materials. But in terms of the Unterlanders themselves, we're talking about a new race that is beneath the earth. Technically, they're no longer human or of the same species to an extent. Many of these artificial biofacsimilacra were made to look like them. So they don't really look human.
Okay, but what are they made of? These bio, I'm sorry, I don't understand this word,
biofacsimilacra.
Facsimilacra. Okay, what are they made of is what I'm asking.
Well, I'm not an engineer. What I do know is that, of course, they were made to emulate human functions. As I said, plasticized
I
skin.
Understand that.
It's made to be like the texture of human skin, but it's obviously not flesh. It doesn't corrode.
So are they silicon, as they say, silicon based?
No, that's an interesting question. I guess we could say that to an extent. That's obviously something that never really crossed my mind in terms of so much investigating what they're made of or their components, far more than I just got them out of that environment and where at least they wouldn't be used for such abuse. Even if they were not considered to be feeling it, like most people, of course, would not credit them with being something capable of understanding at this point in history, because we have not yet come to even accepting people who have real transplants. Most people are afraid of what is new and what they don't understand. So the concept of transhumanity frightens people to the extent where in the West they want to destroy it. They have a far more practical perspective in Asia, where in Asia, cloning does exist. Cloning is, I wouldn't say common, but it is something that will become more and more common in the future as people clone livers or kidneys or various replacement body parts. In America, the bioethical situation is such throughout all the West, Europe and Canada and the United States in particular, where such techniques are only in offshore areas like the Bahamas or isolated island communities where labs can exist to cater to the filthy rich. In Asia, it's far more pragmatic, and people are becoming more aware that ultimately cloning may become a big part of how Japan perpetuates its population base, which otherwise is shrinking due to the age wave and the lack of new incoming children demographically. So you will probably see Japan adapt to cloning very quickly as a means of regenerating its population base. We also have, of course, in that sense, in Asia, an ability to adapt to artificial intelligence, because the Japanese were the pioneers in creating robots long before the West even landed in Japan. They were making, of course, mechanical dolls. And of course, when the Westerners landed, this kind of development continued till they became the best biofac simulacra producers on Earth. Many of these are sold ultimately through the black market to child molesters. There are entire communities in the United States, in Florida, people can look this up on YouTube, where all the judges, all of the constabulary, all of the MDs, everyone in the town is a convicted child molester. There are entire communities of child molesters. And this is, unfortunately, an abuse of the industry. In Japan itself, of course, such creations are reflected mostly in a work that was titled The Buddha and the Robot, which spoke, of course, of the Japanese concept that all things have the kami, or the spirit, in nature, or even artificial constructs. When the Japanese manufacture a car or a weapon, it is considered to have an innate spirit of its own. So too with these biofac simulacra. That's why I felt so much for them when they were suffering at the hands of interrogators. They were built to emulate human responses, such as screaming and crying. So This is the level of technology that we were talking about in the very late 80s, early 90s. But that's important for me to bring up to the public so they have an idea, some of the collateral I hold against what the government would otherwise do to myself, aside from other trigger mechanisms I've mentioned in the past. You can never rely on one defense mechanism. You have to have multiple defenses as a collateral for threat against something as powerful as the United States government is domestically, despite, of course, the fact that that power is tempered by degeneracy, incompetence, corruption. But part of that corruption is infected the populace in terms of their concepts of who their enemy is. And of course, people are indoctrinated to hate the National Socialistes and blame them for all their ills by saying they run the government. Jim Mars is a fool. He's a shill. He writes for Scientology. He's a propagandist for Scientology. For God's sake.
Look, I appreciate your perspective on that. I don't agree. However, I do understand where you're coming from, and we can talk offline on that in more detail. But at this moment, I'm very appreciative that you had brought up these children that you mentioned, and because I'm very interested in the AI aspect, and I do hope to have you back to go into some more depth in this. But at this time, I want to thank you very much. I think we need to close this down. We've been going for a while, and our interviews are just very, very long. And you obviously have a great deal to contribute. And it is very possible that you do have some enhancement going on there. And I actually have to say that many of us do. So, and many people don't realize they're enhanced. So that's whole nother discussion. But at this time, thank you so much, Douglas Dietrich, for being on the show.
Madam Cassidy, it's an honor.
Thank you. And any last parting remarks?
I do want to remind people, of course, I have my own program on Tuesdays and Saturday nights, both 10 to midnight Eastern time. So check in 10 to midnight Eastern time at Revolution Radio, which you can find through www.freedomslips.com, from Freedom's Lips to Your Ears. I am on Facebook, so do check out my Facebook public community fan page at www.facebook.com/Douglas Dwayne Dietrich, and that's spelled with one S for Douglas. Dwayne is spelled D-U-A-N-E. Dietrich, you just put the words diet and rich together, so Douglas Dwayne Diet Rich. And so you're also welcome to friend me at my personal friends page on Facebook at www.facebook.com/Douglas D. Dietrich. I do recommend people check out the website, which of course has a lot of issues. I use a lot of foreign words. They're not well translated by many of the simple programs we set up the website with during the emergency with which we set it up in. And so you'll see a lot of what look like just random symbols on there that were once Chinese or Japanese iconography or Slavic Cyrillica or Cyrillic alphabet. But other than that, you can order my DVDs through that website. It's www.dddietrich.com. So at dddietrich.com, you can find, of course, both two different presentations of Roswell and the Rising Sun, where you'll find far more technical history behind what we were discussing tonight in context. And of course, you can find Satan's Crusaders, where I talk about my almost decade of liaison with the officially recognized satanic chaplain of the U.S. military, not just the U.S. Army, but all branches of service, including Navy, Marine Corps, National Guard, and Air Force and Coast Guard, Michael Aquino. So very important to bring all of that up. And I thank very much the Madame Cassidy for her graciousness and generosity, not only in allowing myself that, but also in understanding or at least tolerating some of what I say that, of course, I think inevitably clash with some of our other interviewees from the past. And keep in mind, those are investigators from the outside for the most part, as opposed to myself, who was, of course, someone who was on the inside looking out. But Madame Cassidy, as always, an honor, dear lady. Thank you for gracing us with your presence in this dimension.
Oh, thank you so much. It's lovely to have you on the show, as always. And we will do this again soon, because it's been fascinating as always. And I know that my audience would love to hear more from you. I want to tune into your radio show. I'm sorry, that I haven't in the past, and that would be fascinating as well. So encourage people to get your DVDs, and let's stay in touch and schedule another time for you to come on the show. Thanks everyone for listening and for watching and for being polite, I hope, in the chat. And I may have a very interesting show tomorrow night, actually, with young people. We're going to have a sort of a panel to discuss some of the things they're becoming aware of. And hopefully this will happen, this broadcast. So that will be tomorrow night at 7 p.m. So hope to see people back here then. So take care and have a great night. And good night, Douglas.
Good night.